Hello everyone, I am Manos Kaling and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. We were supposed to spend 3 nights at the northern base of the Winta Mountains. I was 62, too old to still be doing backcountry patrols, but something drew me back to those high alpine meadows where the air was thin and the silence could drive a man to madness if he wasn't careful. My name is Marcus Webb, and I had been a ranger in Utah's Ashley National Forest for 29 years. 3 decades of watching over 1.5 million acres of wilderness that stretched from the desert canyons of the south to the snow-capped peaks that scraped 11,000 feet into the sky. I had seen every mood the mountains could display. The gentle warmth of summer meadows filled with wildflowers, the savage fury of winter storms that could bury a man in minutes, and the strange, expectant calm that settled over the high country during those brief windows between seasons when the world seemed to hold its breath. But I had never seen anything like what I found during my final patrol in September of 2019. The assignment was routine maintenance, checking weather monitoring stations, assessing trail conditions after the summer season, and documenting any signs of unauthorized camping or resource damage. 3 days alone in country that most people never saw, carrying everything I needed on my back and relying on decades of experience to keep me safe in terrain that could kill the careless or unprepared. I welcomed the solitude. My wife Ellen had passed 2 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, and our children lived scattered across the country with families and careers that left a little time for an aging father who smelled perpetually of pine sap and wood smoke. The mountains had become my only real companions, the only place where I could think clearly about what remained of my life now that the center had fallen out of it. The trail to the monitoring stations began at Moon Lake, a pristine alpine lake surrounded by peaks that rose like cathedral spires into the thin air. I had hiked this route dozens of times over the years, but it never failed to remind me why I had chosen this profession despite the low pay and bureaucratic frustrations. This was country that demanded respect, wilderness that existed on its own terms without compromise or concession to human convenience. The first day's hike took me through aspen groves that burned gold in the September light, their leaves whispering secrets in a language older than human speech. The aspens gave way to dark stands of spruce and fir as I climbed higher, following switchbacks that had been cut by civilian Conservation Corps workers during the Depression. Their craftsmanship had lasted 90 years, testament to the kind of care and pride that modern contractors rarely displayed. I made camp that first night beside an unnamed creek that tumbled down from the peaks in a series of granite pools. The water was snowmelt, cold enough to numb teeth and clear as window glass. I filled my bottles and set up my tent on a flat spot that generations of backpackers had worn smooth, then settled in to watch the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains at night were never truly silent. There was always the whisper of wind through stone, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small animals going about their nocturnal business. But that night the sound seemed muted, distant, as if something was absorbing them before they could travel far. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the absence of noise and feeling unaccountably uneasy, despite 30 years of sleeping alone in the wilderness. It was sometime after midnight when I heard the singing. The voice was high and clear, carrying across the thin air with impossible clarity. A woman's voice, singing a melody I didn't recognize in a language that might have been Native American but sounded older, more primitive. The song rose and fell in patterns that seemed to follow the contours of the landscape, echoing off cliff faces and disappearing into the dark spaces between the peaks. I emerged from my tent and stood listening, trying to determine the direction of the sound. But the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me in harmonies that made the hair on my arms stand up. The melody was beautiful and deeply sad, filled with a longing that spoke to something fundamental in human nature. The desire to return to a place that no longer existed, to find comfort in landscapes that remembered us even when we had forgotten ourselves. The singing continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then faded gradually until only the normal sounds of the mountain night remained. I stayed outside for another hour, waiting to see if it would return, but heard nothing more unusual than the hoot of a great horned owl hunting somewhere in the darkness below my camp. In the morning, I convinced myself that I had been dreaming, The thin air at altitude could play tricks on the mind, and grief had a way of manifesting in unexpected sensory experiences. Ellen had loved music, opera, folk songs, the kind of complex classical pieces that filled our house with beauty during the long winter evenings. It wasn't unreasonable that my subconscious would create phantom melodies to fill the silence she had left behind. The second day's hike took me higher into alpine country, where trees became scarce and the landscape opened into vast meadows bordered by walls of granite and quartzite. This was some of the most remote country in the lower 48 states, accessible only on foot and requiring serious commitment to reach. The monitoring stations were scattered across a 20-mile area, each one requiring hours of hiking to access and service. I found the first station in good condition, its solar panels clean and its data logger functioning normally. The weather readings showed typical patterns for the season: cold nights, warm days, the gradual transition toward winter that would soon lock this country under snow for 6 months. But there was one anomaly that caught my attention: temperature readings that spiked far above normal for several hours during the previous week, then dropped back to expected levels with no explanation. Equipment malfunction seemed the most likely explanation, but I made note of the readings and continued toward the second station. The trail wound through country that grew increasingly surreal as I climbed higher, vast meadows that seemed to stretch forever, punctuated by islands of stone that rose like ancient monuments against the sky. The scale was overwhelming, designed to make humans feel small and temporary in the face of geological time. It was mid-afternoon when I found the garden. I crested a small rise and looked down into a circular meadow perhaps half a mile across, surrounded by peaks that formed a natural amphitheater. The meadow should have been filled with the browns and golds of autumn grass, but instead it blazed with colors that had no business existing at this elevation in September. Brilliant reds and purples, electric blues and yellows that seemed to glow with their own internal light. I descended into the meadow for a closer look and discovered that the colors came from flowers, thousands of them, arranged in precise geometric patterns that formed mandalas of stunning complexity. But these weren't any flowers I recognized from 30 years of botanical observation in these mountains. The blooms were too large, too vivid, and they grew in soil that should have been too poor and rocky to support such abundance. At the center of the floral mandala stood a structure that defied easy description. It appeared to be made from bones, not the scattered remains of animals that had died naturally, but carefully arranged architectural elements that formed walls, arches, and delicate spires that reached toward the sky. The bones were white as fresh snow and smooth as polished marble, fitted together with such precision that no mortar or binding agent was visible. I approached the structure cautiously, every instinct developed over decades in the wilderness screaming warnings about the wrongness of what I was seeing. The bones were massive, femurs thick as fence posts, ribs that could have come from creatures the size of automobiles, skulls with eye sockets large enough to hold basketballs. But they weren't from any animals that existed in the modern world. The proportions were wrong, the shapes too alien for anything that had evolved on this planet. The structure was hollow inside, forming a circular chamber perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with walls that curved upward to meet in a domed ceiling. The floor was covered with more of the impossible flowers, their petals forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the chamber stood a single massive bone, perhaps a femur from some unimaginable creature, that had been carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. I should have left immediately. Should have backed away from the bone garden and returned to familiar territory where the rules of nature still applied. But something about the structure compelled closer examination. A sense that I was looking at something important, something that represented knowledge lost to human understanding for thousands of years. I photographed everything, though the images captured on my digital camera somehow failed to convey the vivid colors and impossible scale of what I was seeing. The flowers appeared washed out and ordinary in the photos. The bone structure looked like weathered rock formations, and the carved symbols on the central pillar showed up as natural erosion patterns. As evening approached, I made the decision to camp in the meadow despite every rational voice in my head, arguing for retreat to safer ground. I set up my tent at the edge of the flower garden, close enough to observe but far enough away to provide some illusion of safety. The sunset that night was spectacular, painting the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to be reflected and amplified by the flowers around me. The singing began as darkness fell, but this time I was ready for it. The voice was the same, that clear, high tone that carried impossible distances through the thin air. But now I could see its source, a figure moving among the flowers in the bone garden, tending to blooms that glowed softly in the starlight. The figure was human in general shape, but wrong in specific details. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in ways that suggested additional joints. It moved with fluid grace through the garden, touching flowers that responded to its presence by brightening and shifting color. The creature, for I couldn't think of it as entirely human despite its basic form, seemed to be cultivating the garden according to patterns that my eyes couldn't quite follow, but my mind recognized as fundamentally mathematical. I watched for hours as it worked, completely absorbed in its task and apparently unaware of my presence. The singing continued throughout its labors, sometimes rising to volumes that should have echoed across the entire valley, sometimes dropping to barely audible whispers that seemed to speak directly to individual flowers. The melody never repeated exactly, but underlying patterns emerged that suggested a language of music more complex than anything humans had ever developed. Toward dawn, the creature approached the bone structure and disappeared inside. The singing stopped, the flowers dimmed to normal visibility, and the meadow returned to something approaching ordinary appearance. But I had seen enough to know that I was witnessing something that existed outside the boundaries of conventional understanding. Something ancient and powerful that had been hidden in these remote mountains for longer than human civilization had existed. I should have hiked out immediately, should have reported my findings to supervisors who would have dismissed them as altitude-induced hallucinations or stress-related delusions. Instead, I spent the day exploring the meadow more thoroughly, documenting details that my camera couldn't capture and trying to understand the purpose behind the impossible garden. The flowers were real. I could touch them, smell their strange perfumes, even taste the nectar that some produced in quantities far beyond what their size should have allowed. But they showed characteristics that defied botanical classification. Some bloomed continuously, producing new flowers even as old ones wilted and died. Others seemed to respond to my presence, brightening when I approached and dimming when I moved away. A few appeared to be communicating with each other through color changes and chemical releases that created complex patterns across the entire garden. The bone structure yielded even stranger discoveries. The individual bones were carved with microscopic precision, their surfaces covered with symbols that formed nested hierarchies of meaning. Mathematical formulas were interwoven with what looked like star charts. Biological diagrams were combined with geometric patterns that extended into dimensions my mind couldn't quite grasp. The central pillar contained the most complex carvings, symbols that seemed to describe relationships between forces and entities that existed beyond normal reality. I made rubbings of some of the carvings using paper and charcoal, though the images I captured bore only superficial resemblance to what I could see with my naked eyes. The symbols seemed to exist partially outside normal space, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions and reflecting light in ways that suggested depth and complexity far beyond their apparent surface features. That second night, I witnessed the true purpose of the garden. As darkness fell and the singing began, creatures emerged from the surrounding peaks. Not the tall, thin figure I had seen the night before, but beings that defied any attempt at description. Some appeared to be made from condensed starlight. Others seemed constructed from living shadow that moved with predatory intelligence. A few might have been plants or fungi that had achieved consciousness and mobility, while others looked like geometric shapes that had learned to exist in three-dimensional space. They gathered in the meadow around the bone structure, forming circles within circles as the singing rose to volumes that should have shattered stone. The flowers responded to their presence by blazing with light that illuminated the entire valley, creating a beacon that must have been visible for hundreds of miles if anyone had been positioned to see it. What followed was clearly a ritual, though its purpose remained opaque to my human understanding. The creatures moved through complex patterns around the garden, their positions corresponding to mathematical relationships that governed the placement of flowers and the arrangement of symbols on the bones. The singing became increasingly complex, with harmonies that seemed to open doorways in the air itself. Through those doorways, I glimpsed other places, landscapes that existed under alien stars, cities built from materials that violated physical laws, oceans that flowed upward into skies filled with impossible colors. The beings in the meadow were not native to Earth, I realized. They were visitors, perhaps refugees who had found ways to exist in hidden spaces where the boundaries between worlds wore thin. The garden was their anchor point, a place where they could maintain contact with their origins while adapting to the hostile environment of our reality. The flowers were not decorations, but functional elements in some vast mechanism that I was only beginning to comprehend. Each bloom was a node in a network that extended across dimensions, connecting this remote meadow to places that existed in the spaces between stars. I watched until dawn, memorizing details that I knew no one would believe even if I could find words to describe them. When the last of the visitors had departed through their dimensional doorways and the garden had returned to its daytime appearance, I packed my equipment and prepared to leave. But as I shouldered my pack, the tall, thin figure emerged from the bone structure and approached me directly. Up close, it was clearly not human despite its bipedal form. Its skin had the texture of bark from an ancient tree, marked with patterns that might have been natural coloration or intentional scarification. Its face was elongated, with eyes that contained depths suggesting intelligence far older than human civilization. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind without passing through my ears. "You have seen what others cannot see," it said in a voice like wind through stone. "You understand that this place exists between the spaces your kind recognize. The question now is what you will do with this knowledge." I found myself answering without conscious decision to speak. "I don't know. I don't understand what I've witnessed or what it means. Understanding comes with time and willingness to accept truths that challenge the boundaries of your reality," the creature replied. "We have been gardeners here for millennia, tending connections that prevent our exile from becoming permanent separation. Your arrival suggests that the barriers between worlds are weakening, that soon others of your kind will discover places like this. What do you want from me?" "Protection, discretion, the understanding that some knowledge carries responsibilities that extend beyond individual curiosity." The creature gestured toward the garden where flowers were already beginning to dim as sunlight strengthened. "This place exists because it remains hidden. Discovery by those who lack wisdom would destroy not only our sanctuary, but the delicate balance that keeps reality separate." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully understood the implications of what I was agreeing to. The creature seemed to sense my uncertainty because it touched my forehead with one long finger, and suddenly my mind was filled with images, visions of what would happen if the garden was discovered by people who viewed it as a threat or a resource to be exploited. I saw military teams descending on the meadow, scientists dissecting flowers that lost their properties when removed from their native soil, government agencies trying to weaponize dimensional doorways they couldn't understand or control. I saw the garden dying as its connection to other realities was severed, leaving only ordinary flowers and weather-bleached bones in a high mountain meadow that no longer served any purpose beyond providing grazing for the occasional elk. "I understand," I said, and meant it completely. The creature nodded and withdrew its finger, leaving me with residual images that would fade but never entirely disappear. "You may return if you choose, but only alone and only with respect for what you have witnessed. Others of your kind may be shown this place in time, but only those who can be trusted with secrets that affect the stability of multiple realities." With that, it turned and walked back into the bone structure, disappearing through an entrance that seemed to fold in on itself until only solid wall remained. I stood alone in the meadow, as normal daylight banished the last traces of otherworldly luminescence from the flowers around me. The hike back to my vehicle took 2 days, but the time passed in a blur of confused thoughts and partially suppressed memories. By the time I reached the trailhead, I had constructed a cover story that would satisfy my supervisors without revealing anything about what I had actually discovered. Equipment malfunction at the monitoring stations, challenging weather conditions, the need for follow-up maintenance that would require additional trips to the area. I submitted my report and requested assignment to ongoing monitoring duties in the Uinta backcountry. My age and experience made me the logical choice for solo missions to remote areas, and no one questioned my sudden enthusiasm for work that younger rangers typically avoided. Over the following months, I made regular trips to the garden, always alone and always under the pretext of routine maintenance activities. Each visit revealed new aspects of the place and its purposes. The creatures I had initially seen were only the most visible inhabitants of a community that existed primarily in dimensions adjacent to our own. The garden served as embassy, laboratory, and safe house for beings who were simultaneously exploring our reality and hiding from forces in their own that viewed contact with humans as dangerous or forbidden. I learned that the flowers were not plants in any terrestrial sense, but living technologies that processed energy drawn from multiple dimensional sources. The bone structure was a computational device of staggering complexity, its carved symbols forming programs that regulated the flow of information and matter between worlds. The singing I had heard was both communication and maintenance protocol, keeping the entire system functioning within parameters that prevented catastrophic interactions between incompatible realities. The beings themselves were refugees from a cosmic conflict that spanned thousands of years and involved civilizations that existed on scales incomprehensible to human understanding. Earth had been chosen as a hiding place because our primitive technology and limited awareness made us unlikely to interfere with their presence. But they recognized that human development was accelerating toward levels that would eventually make concealment impossible. Some among them advocated for direct contact, believing that humans were capable of understanding and respecting their situation. Others argued for complete withdrawal, abandoning Earth before we advanced enough to detect their presence accidentally. The garden existed partly as an experiment in limited contact, a way of testing whether individual humans could be trusted with knowledge of their existence. I became their primary test subject, the sole human who knew of their presence and had regular access to their sanctuary. Through me, they observed human nature and assessed our species' readiness for broader contact. The responsibility was overwhelming at times, knowing that my actions and reactions might influence decisions that affected the future of both civilizations. But I also found purpose in the role that I hadn't experienced since Ellen's death. For the first time in years, I felt like my life had meaning beyond simple maintenance of trails and enforcement of camping regulations. I was serving as ambassador to beings whose knowledge could transform human understanding of reality itself, if we proved capable of handling such revelations without destroying ourselves or them in the process. The arrangements continued for 3 years, with me making monthly visits to the garden and serving as the primary point of contact between species separated by millions of years of evolution and completely different approaches to existence. I learned fragments of their language, glimpsed aspects of their history, and gained insights into technologies that seemed like magic, but followed principles that were simply more advanced than anything humans had discovered. In return, I provided them with information about human society and individual psychology that helped them understand whether contact was advisable or whether continued hiding remained their safest option. They were particularly interested in human responses to phenomena that challenged established beliefs, studying how individuals and institutions reacted when confronted with evidence that their understanding of reality was incomplete. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but in my 3rd year of contact, something went wrong. I arrived at the garden during what should have been a routine visit to find the meadow in chaos. The flowers were dying, their brilliant colors fading to gray as I watched. The bone structure showed signs of damage, not physical destruction, but some kind of systemic failure that left the carved symbols dark and lifeless. The singing that normally accompanied my visits was replaced by sounds of distress, harmonies that spoke of pain and impending loss. The tall, thin creature emerged from the structure, but its movements were labored and its bark-like skin showed patterns of decay that spread even as I watched. "We have been discovered," it said, the words forming in my mind with overtones of resignation and fear. "Not by your kind, but by those we fled from originally. The garden's energy signature has grown too strong to conceal, and they have found ways to trace our presence across dimensional barriers. What can I do to help?" I asked, though I already suspected that human capabilities were inadequate for dealing with threats that operated on cosmic scales. "Nothing and everything," the creature replied. "We must abandon this sanctuary and seek another hiding place, but the knowledge we have gathered here must not be lost." You have been chosen to preserve what can be preserved, to maintain connections that might allow restoration when it becomes safe to return. Before I could ask what that meant, the creature pressed something into my hands, a small object that felt like polished bone but seemed to contain depths that extended far beyond its physical boundaries. This is a seed from the garden, containing compressed information about everything we have built here. Plant it in a place of your choosing, tend it with the knowledge you have gained, and it will grow into a new sanctuary when the time is right. The creature turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me one final time. Thank you for proving that some among your species can be trusted with truths that transcend the boundaries of ordinary experience. That knowledge will influence decisions that affect the future of both our peoples. With that, it walked back into the bone structure, which began to collapse in on itself with sounds like distant thunder. The remaining flowers burst into brief, brilliant flame before crumbling to ash that was scattered by winds that seemed to come from directions that didn't exist in normal space. Within minutes, the meadow contained nothing but ordinary mountain grass and a few pieces of weathered bone that could have come from any large animal that had died in the wilderness. I stood alone in the aftermath, holding the seed-like object and trying to process what I had witnessed. The garden was gone, the creatures had fled to hiding places I couldn't imagine, and I was left with the responsibility of preserving knowledge that could reshape human understanding of reality, if I could find ways to share it without triggering the kind of institutional response that had driven them away in the first place. I completed my patrol as scheduled, documenting normal conditions at all monitoring stations and reporting no unusual findings. But when I returned home, I began preparing for a different kind of responsibility than any I had anticipated when I chose to become a ranger 30 years earlier. The seed required special care and conditions that I was still learning to understand. I planted it in a remote corner of my property, in soil that I had treated with minerals gathered from the original garden site. It grew slowly but steadily, producing flowers that were pale shadows of the brilliant blooms I remembered but which still showed properties that defied botanical explanation. As the years passed, I documented everything I had learned about the creatures and their technology, creating archives that would preserve their knowledge even if I was unable to find others capable of understanding its significance. I made contact with researchers and academics who studied anomalous phenomena, looking for individuals who might be ready to accept truths that challenged established scientific paradigms. Some dismissed my accounts as fantasy or delusion. Others showed interest but lacked the mental flexibility to grasp concepts that extended beyond human experience. A few demonstrated the kind of open-minded curiosity that might eventually make them suitable guardians for the knowledge I had been entrusted to preserve. I retired from the Forest Service at 65, but continued making regular trips to the original garden site to monitor for signs that the creatures might be returning. The meadow remained ordinary in appearance, but sometimes I detected subtle anomalies. Temperature variations that didn't match weather patterns, electromagnetic readings that suggested hidden energy sources, occasional glimpses of colors that disappeared when observed directly. The seed in my garden grew into a small but functioning version of the original sanctuary, complete with flowers that showed signs of interdimensional connectivity and structures that began to emerge from the soil as the plant matured. I tended it carefully, following instructions that seemed to download directly into my consciousness from the seed itself. Now at 71, I find myself in the position of preparing for my own eventual departure, while ensuring that the knowledge and responsibility I carry will not be lost. The seed has grown into something that could serve as a contact point if the original creatures ever feel safe enough to return, and I have identified several younger researchers who show the wisdom and discretion necessary to serve as its guardians. The mountains still call to me, though my aging body can no longer answer as readily as it once did. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seem closer than usual, I can hear echoes of the singing that once filled the air around the bone garden. It reminds me that there are wonders in this world that exist beyond human understanding, and that our role is not to possess or control them, but to protect and nurture them until they can flourish once again. The garden may be gone, but its purpose lives on in the connections it established and the knowledge it preserved. And somewhere in the spaces between realities, beings who once called Earth home continue their work of bridging worlds and preserving the delicate balance that keeps multiple universes from colliding in ways that would destroy them all. I am honored to have played a small part in that work, and I hope that those who come after me will prove equally worthy of the trust that spans species and dimensions to connect us all in purposes larger than any individual understanding can contain. I hadn't been back to the Everglades in over a decade, but when they found bones near the old trailhead, they called me, the only one who still remembered what happened in 2003. My name is Catherine Rivera, and at 53 I was officially retired from the National Park Service after 26 years of watching over some of the most unforgiving wilderness in America. The Everglades had been my specialty, that vast expanse of sawgrass and mangrove swamps where the line between land and water disappeared into something that was neither and both. Most people saw it as empty wasteland, but I knew better. The Everglades were alive in ways that defied easy understanding, breathing with tides that followed rhythms older than human civilization. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, interrupting my morning coffee on the porch of my small house in Homestead. Detective Ray Santos, someone I'd worked with during my active years, his voice carrying the particular strain that meant he was dealing with something that didn't fit normal categories. "Cat, we need you to take a look at something. You remember that area off the Anhinga Trail about 3 miles and where the old Calusa shell mounds are? A couple of kayakers found human remains, but there's something wrong with the scene." "Wrong how?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "The bones are arranged, deliberately, and they're old, but not old enough. Carbon dating says they're from the 1940s, but the arrangement, it's fresh, like someone just finished setting them up yesterday." I told Ray I'd be there by noon, though every instinct I'd developed over 2.5 decades was screaming at me to stay home, to let someone else deal with whatever was happening in the deep swamp. But there were things about the Everglades that I'd never shared in my official reports. Knowledge that couldn't be documented in case files or explained to investigators who dealt in facts and evidence. The Everglades existed in multiple time streams simultaneously. Most people experienced only the surface layer, the present moment flowing steadily from past to future, like the slow water that moved through the sawgrass prairies. But in certain places, under specific conditions, you could slip between temporal currents and find yourself experiencing events that had happened decades ago, or might happen years in the future. I'd learned this the hard way during an incident in 2003 that had cost me 6 months of memory and nearly ended my career. The official explanation was heat stroke and dehydration leading to severe confusion and temporary amnesia. The truth was something that no one in the administrative hierarchy would have believed or accepted. The drive to Everglades National Park took 40 minutes through suburban sprawl that was gradually being reclaimed by subtropical vegetation. South Florida existed in a constant state of negotiation between human development and natural forces that refused to be permanently contained. Every hurricane season brought reminders of who really controlled this landscape, but most residents preferred to ignore such inconvenient truths. I met Ray at the ranger station near Anhinga Trail, where he was coordinating with park personnel and the medical examiner's team. Ray was in his 50s, a competent investigator who'd seen enough unusual cases in South Florida to maintain some flexibility about what was possible, but even he looked unsettled as he briefed me on what they'd discovered. "The kayakers found the first arrangement yesterday morning," he explained, spreading crime scene photos across a picnic table. Human skull and long bones arranged in a perfect circle, with smaller bones forming geometric patterns inside. Everything positioned with mathematical precision. The photographs showed exactly what he'd described. Bones that had been cleaned and weathered by decades of exposure, but arranged with the kind of care that suggested ritual purpose. The positioning was too precise to be random, too complex to be the work of animals or natural processes. "That's not all," Ray continued. "We found 2 more sites within a half-mile radius. Same pattern, same apparent age of the bones, same level of careful arrangement. But here's the really weird part. The soil underneath the arrangements shows no signs of disturbance. No evidence that anyone dug holes or moved earth around. It's like the bones just materialized in those exact positions." I studied the photographs more carefully, noting details that would be invisible to investigators without extensive experience in the Everglades ecosystem. The arrangements were positioned at specific points relative to water flow and elevation changes, following patterns that corresponded to seasonal variations in the swamp's hydrology. Whoever or whatever had created them understood the landscape's temporal rhythms in ways that suggested intimate familiarity with the region's deepest secrets. "I need to see the sights in person," I told Ray. "And I need to go alone. Kat, this is an active crime scene. I can't just..." "Ray, trust me on this. You called me because I know things about the Everglades that other people don't. If you want answers, you need to let me investigate this my way." He studied my face for a long moment, reading the seriousness behind my request. We'd worked together long enough for him to know that I didn't make unreasonable demands or waste time on unnecessary complications. "Okay," he said finally. "But you take a radio, you check in every hour, and if anything happens to you, I'm calling in the cavalry." The airboat ride to the bone sites took 30 minutes through channels that wound between islands of hardwood hammock and open expanses of sawgrass prairie. March was the dry season, when water levels dropped enough to reveal limestone outcroppings and expose areas that remained submerged for most of the year. It was also the time when the temporal boundaries in the Everglades became most permeable, allowing glimpses of other chronological layers that normally remained hidden beneath the surface of everyday experience. I'd piloted airboats through these waters for over 2 decades, but the landscape always managed to surprise me with new configurations of land and water. The Everglades changed constantly, responding to seasonal patterns, storm damage, and subtle shifts in the underlying bedrock that controlled water flow. What looked like permanent features could disappear overnight, while new islands and channels emerged from areas that had been uniform marsh for decades. The first bone site was located on a small island of ancient shell mound, built up over centuries by Calusa Indians who'd understood the Everglades' temporal properties long before European contact. The mound rose perhaps 10 feet above the surrounding water level, covered with hardwood trees that provided the only significant elevation in miles of flat wetland. I beached the airboat and approached the arrangement carefully, aware that I was entering space that might not conform to normal temporal rules. The bones were exactly as shown in the photographs, human remains arranged in complex geometric patterns that seemed to serve purposes beyond simple artistic expression. But seeing them in person revealed details that cameras couldn't capture. The bones were warm to the touch despite being shaded by tree canopy. They hummed with a barely audible vibration that seemed to resonate in harmony with the subtle sounds of the swamp. The whisper of wind through sawgrass, the distant splash of feeding fish, the rhythmic chorus of frogs and insects that provided the soundtrack to Everglades' existence. As I examined the arrangement more closely, I began to recognize the pattern. The bones formed a mandala that corresponded to tidal cycles and seasonal water level changes, a 3-dimensional map of the region's temporal geography. Each element was positioned to mark specific points in the complex rhythms that governed life and death in the wetlands. I was photographing the arrangement when the first shift occurred. The quality of light changed subtly, taking on the golden cast that characterized late afternoon, despite my watch showing early afternoon. The sounds of the swamp shifted to different frequencies, with bird calls that belonged to species I hadn't heard in this area for years. When I looked toward the water, I saw an airboat in the distance. Not the modern aluminum craft I'd arrived in, but an older wooden vessel of the type that had been used by park rangers in the 1960s. I was experiencing temporal displacement, slipping backward through the chronological layers that accumulated in places where significant events had created lasting impressions on the landscape itself. The bone arrangements weren't just ritual markers, they were anchors that stabilized specific moments in time, allowing access to historical periods that normally remained sealed beneath the surface of the present. The wooden airboat approached my island, piloted by a figure in ranger uniform that I recognized despite the decades that separated us. It was me, but younger, the Catherine Rivera who'd worked these waters in 2003, before the incident that had taught me to be more careful about temporal boundaries in the deep swamp. She beached her boat and walked toward the bone arrangement, moving with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned to fear the deeper mysteries of the Everglades. I watched myself examine the bones with scientific curiosity, rather than the wary respect that experience had taught me. This was the moment that had started everything. The discovery that led to 6 months of missing time and knowledge that I'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The younger Catherine reached toward the central skull of the arrangement, and I found myself moving to stop her, knowing what would happen if she made contact with bones that existed simultaneously in multiple time periods. But my hand passed through her arm like she was made of water and memory rather than flesh and blood. She touched the skull, and the world exploded into fragments of overlapping time. I experienced the next several hours or years or decades as a cascade of disconnected moments that occurred simultaneously in the same physical space, but across different temporal coordinates. I saw Calusa shamans creating the original bone arrangements centuries before European contact, using human remains to mark points where the spirit world intersected with ordinary reality. I witnessed Spanish explorers stumbling upon the arrangements and fleeing in terror from phenomena they couldn't understand or control. I watched park rangers from different eras discovering and rediscovering the sites, each generation adding their own interpretation to mysteries that defied conventional explanation. Some tried to remove the bones, only to find them restored to their original positions within days. Others attempted to document the arrangement scientifically, producing reports that were inevitably classified or dismissed by supervisors who preferred to avoid complications that couldn't be explained in terms of normal park management issues. Through it all, the bones remained constant, anchors that prevented the temporal streams from drifting too far apart, maintaining connections between past and future that served purposes I was only beginning to understand. They were part of a larger system that regulated time flow throughout the Everglades, preventing paradoxes and maintaining the delicate balance that allowed multiple chronological layers to coexist without destroying each other. But something was going wrong with the system. The arrangements were becoming unstable, their temporal anchoring beginning to fail as the natural rhythms they were designed to follow were disrupted by climate change and human development. The bones were reaching across time to find someone who could restore their proper functioning before the failure cascaded into something that would affect the entire region. I was that someone. My experience in 2003 had created a permanent connection between my consciousness and the temporal mechanics of the swamp. The missing 6 months hadn't been lost to amnesia. They'd been spent learning to navigate chronological currents that existed outside normal human experience. Now the bones were calling me back to complete work that I'd begun 2 decades earlier, without fully understanding its significance. The realization brought me back to present moment awareness with jarring suddenness. I was standing beside the bone arrangement on the shell mound, but the sun was setting despite my having arrived in early afternoon. According to my watch, only 20 minutes had passed, but the shadows and light quality indicated that hours had elapsed in normal time. I radioed Ray with a brief status report, claiming that I was still examining the sites and needed more time for thorough documentation. He wasn't happy about the delay, but he agreed to extend my access to the crime scene until the following morning. Night in the Everglades was unlike darkness anywhere else I'd experienced. The absence of light pollution revealed star patterns that most people never saw, while the constant background chorus of wildlife created an auditory landscape that could be both comforting and deeply unsettling. But tonight was different. The normal sounds were muted, replaced by harmonics that seemed to emerge from the bones themselves. I made camp on the shell mound, setting up a small tent near the bone arrangement, but not so close that I might accidentally trigger another temporal displacement. As darkness deepened, the humming from the bones grew more pronounced, joined by similar sounds from the other sites within the area. The arrangements were communicating with each other, coordinating some kind of activity that would reach its peak during the hours before dawn. Around midnight, the singing began. It started as barely audible harmonies that seemed to emerge from the water itself. Voices that might have been wind, or might have been the echoes of people who'd died in the swamp decades earlier. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, filled with longing for times and places that existed only in memory. But they were also functional, each note corresponding to specific adjustments in the temporal field that surrounded the bone arrangements. I found myself singing along without conscious decision, my voice adding harmonies that I somehow knew despite never having heard the melodies before. The music was teaching itself to me as I participated, downloading knowledge directly into my consciousness through frequencies that bypassed normal auditory processing. Through the songs, I learned the true history of the bone arrangements and their purpose in maintaining temporal stability throughout the Everglades ecosystem. The original creators had been refugees from a civilization that had mastered time travel, but destroyed itself through temporal warfare. They'd fled to Earth during the last ice age, seeking a place where they could hide from enemies who pursued them across multiple timelines. The Everglades had been chosen as their sanctuary because its unique hydrology created natural temporal anomalies that could be enhanced and controlled through careful engineering. The bone arrangements were components in a vast machine that regulated time flow throughout the region, preventing paradoxes and maintaining the barriers that kept their enemies from detecting their presence. For thousands of years, the system had functioned automatically, maintained by descendants who gradually lost understanding of its original purpose but continued to follow the rituals necessary for its operation. The Calusa had been the last generation to possess complete knowledge of the temporal mechanics, but even they had understood only fragments of the technology they were preserving. Now the system was failing. Climate change was disrupting the hydrological patterns that powered the temporal stabilizers. Rising sea levels threatened to flood the shell mounds that housed critical components. Most dangerously, the consciousness that had originally designed the system was beginning to reawaken, responding to the crisis by reaching across time to find individuals capable of understanding and repairing the damage. I was one of those individuals. My experience in 2003 had been a recruitment process, an evaluation of my potential usefulness to entities that existed primarily in temporal dimensions rather than physical space. The missing 6 months had been spent in accelerated training, learning to perceive and manipulate chronological currents that normal humans couldn't detect. Now I was being activated to perform the maintenance that only someone with my specific combination of knowledge and temporal sensitivity could accomplish. The work would require me to spend extended periods existing partially outside normal time, making adjustments to systems that spanned centuries while remaining anchored enough in the present to prevent myself from becoming lost in the chronological maze. The singing continued until dawn, teaching me the techniques I would need and preparing my consciousness for operations that would strain the boundaries between past, present, and future. When the sun rose, I found myself changed in ways that were subtle but fundamental. I could see the temporal currents that flowed through the landscape, visualize the points where chronological streams intersected and diverged, and sense the areas where the stabilization system was beginning to break down. The work began immediately, using knowledge that had been programmed into my consciousness through the night's musical downloads. I began making adjustments to the bone arrangements that would restore their proper functioning. Each change required careful calibration to ensure that modifications in one time period wouldn't create paradoxes in another. I moved between the 3 sites throughout the day, spending hours that felt like months as I worked in temporal dimensions where normal chronology didn't apply. From the outside, anyone watching would have seen me making small adjustments to the positioning of ancient bones. From the inside, I was performing complex surgery on the fabric of time itself. The work was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical effort. Maintaining consciousness across multiple temporal streams required constant mental discipline, while the knowledge I was accessing came with emotional weight from the civilizations that had created and maintained the system. I experienced fragments of their history, the wars that had driven them from their original timeline, the desperate search for sanctuary, the gradual acceptance that they might never be able to return home. But I also felt their gratitude toward Earth and its inhabitants for providing refuge, and their determination to protect this sanctuary from the forces that had destroyed their original civilization. The temporal stabilization system wasn't just about hiding from enemies. It was about preserving a place where time could flow naturally, without the artificial manipulation that had turned their home into a battleground where past and future became weapons. By evening, I had completed the primary repairs to the bone arrangements. The humming that emanated from them had changed to harmonies that spoke of restored balance and renewed stability. The temporal currents that flowed through the region were once again following their intended patterns, maintaining the barriers that kept the Everglades isolated from the chronological conflicts that raged in other dimensions. But the work wasn't finished. The system required ongoing maintenance that only someone with my training could provide. I would need to return regularly, monitoring the temporal field and making adjustments as conditions changed. The refugee consciousness that had recruited me would provide guidance and support, But the actual work had to be performed by someone who existed primarily in this timeline. I called Ray to report that my investigation was complete and that I'd found explanations for the unusual bone arrangements. Ancient burial practices, I told him, possibly related to Calusa spiritual beliefs about the connection between death and seasonal cycles. The arrangements weren't recent. They'd been exposed by changes in water level that had made them visible for the first time in decades. It wasn't exactly a lie, though it omitted the more complex truths about temporal mechanics and refugee civilizations that existed outside normal historical frameworks. Ray accepted my explanation with the kind of relief that suggested he'd been hoping for something that would close the case without requiring further investigation. The official report described the bone arrangements as archaeological artifacts of probable Native American origin, recommended that they be left undisturbed pending consultation with tribal representatives, and suggested that the area be reclassified to provide better protection for significant cultural resources. But my real work was just beginning. Over the following months, I developed a routine of regular visits to the deep Everglades, ostensibly for wildlife photography and personal recreation, but actually to maintain the temporal stabilization system that kept one of Earth's most important ecosystems functioning properly. I learned to navigate between time streams with increasing skill, accessing historical periods when necessary to repair damage or adjust components that existed across multiple chronological layers. The work brought me into contact with the refugee consciousness that had originally designed the system, beings of vast intelligence and profound sadness who had been guarding this sanctuary for millennia. They taught me about the nature of time itself, not the linear progression that humans perceived, but a complex multi-dimensional structure where past and future existed simultaneously and could be navigated like geography. They showed me the scars left by temporal warfare in other regions of space-time, places where the fabric of reality had been damaged by civilizations that treated chronology as a resource to be exploited rather than a delicate system to be preserved. Earth was one of the few remaining refuges where time flowed naturally, protected by ancient systems like the one in the Everglades that maintained barriers against the forces that sought to turn all of history into a weapon. My work wasn't just about preserving a wetland ecosystem. It was about protecting one of the last places in the universe where the past remained fixed and the future remained open to possibility. The responsibility was overwhelming at times, knowing that my actions affected not just the Everglades but the temporal stability of the entire region. Mistakes could create paradoxes that would ripple through decades of history, while neglect could allow the barriers to fail and expose Earth to the kind of chronological warfare that had destroyed the refugees' original civilization. But the work also brought profound satisfaction. I was participating in something larger than any individual human understanding, helping to preserve a system that had protected Earth for thousands of years. The refugees' gratitude was palpable during my interactions with them, their relief at finding someone capable of maintaining their carefully constructed sanctuary. As months became years, I developed a deeper appreciation for the Everglades' true nature. What most people saw as empty wilderness was actually one of the most sophisticated temporal engineering projects in the known universe, a living machine that regulated chronological flow throughout a significant portion of Earth's surface. Every aspect of the ecosystem served multiple purposes. The seasonal flooding cycles powered temporal generators. The complex food webs provided biological metaphors for chronological relationships, and the apparent emptiness concealed technologies that operated on principles beyond current human understanding. I became the ecosystem's human guardian, the bridge between refugee consciousness and terrestrial reality that allowed ancient systems to continue functioning in a world that had changed dramatically since their installation. The work required constant learning and adaptation, as climate change and human development created new challenges for maintaining temporal stability. But it also connected me to purposes larger than any individual lifetime, part of a project that spanned species and civilizations in service of preserving something precious, the natural flow of time itself, unmarked by artificial manipulation or weaponization. In protecting the Everglades, I was protecting the past that had made the present possible and the future that remained open to hope. The bone arrangements still rest on their shell mounds, appearing to casual observers as ancient artifacts of unknown purpose. But I know them as components in a temporal stabilization system that keeps one small part of the universe safe from forces that would turn all of history into a battlefield. They sing their maintenance songs during the dark hours before dawn, harmonies that regulate the flow of time itself, and maintain barriers that protect not just the Everglades, but the entire world from chronological dangers that most humans couldn't imagine. I continue my work as their guardian and maintenance technician, traveling between time streams to make the adjustments necessary for their continued operation. It's not the retirement I had planned, but it's the purpose I was meant to serve, protecting the delicate balance that allows past and future to coexist without destroying each other in the process. Sometimes, during my travels through the temporal currents that flow beneath the surface of everyday experience, I encounter other guardians, individuals who've been recruited to maintain similar systems in other parts of the world. We share knowledge and techniques, supporting each other in work that can never be officially recognized or rewarded, but which remains essential for the continued existence of reality itself. The Everglades continue to change with each season, but their deeper purpose remains constant. A sanctuary where time flows as it was meant to flow, protected by ancient engineering and modern dedication from forces that would corrupt the very foundation of existence. I am honored to serve as part of that protection, a temporary guardian of systems that connect all moments into the coherent whole we call history. In the end, that's what we're all protecting, not just landscapes or ecosystems, but the continuity that allows the past to inform the present and the present to shape the future. The bone arrangements sing their temporal songs each night, maintaining the rhythms that keep one small part of the universe in tune with the natural order that underlies all existence. And I sing with them, adding my voice to harmonies that span centuries and species in service of preserving the time between tides, those eternal moments when all possibilities remain open and the future waits to be written by those wise enough to understand the weight of their choices. The sound came from inside the tree line, a kind of breathing, rhythmic, measured, and far too deep to be human. I was 49 years old and had spent the last 14 years as a ranger in Olympic National Park, where the temperate rainforest stretched from sea level to alpine peaks in a green tapestry that most visitors found overwhelmingly beautiful. My name is David Chin, and I knew these forests better than most. The way morning mist clung to old-growth cedars, the particular quality of silence that settled between the massive trunks, and the places where that silence became something more than mere absence of sound. The breathing had started 3 days earlier, during what should have been a routine patrol of the Hoh River backcountry. I'd been checking wilderness campsites for compliance violations when I first heard it. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the forest itself, rather than any particular source. At first, I'd dismissed it as wind through the canopy or the distant sound of waves against the coastline 12 miles away. But wind didn't maintain such regular rhythm, and ocean sounds didn't carry that sense of consciousness, of something vast and patient taking careful breaths in the darkness between the trees. I'd come to Olympic after burning out from 7 years with the Seattle Police Department, drawn by the promise of protecting wilderness instead of trying to maintain order in a city that seemed determined to destroy itself. The transition from urban law enforcement to backcountry ranger work had been challenging, but I'd found peace in the forest's indifference to human problems. Trees didn't lie, wildlife didn't file false reports, and the criminals I dealt with were mostly inexperienced hikers who'd gotten lost or failed to secure their food properly. But the breathing suggested something that existed outside my experience with either urban crime or wilderness management. It carried implications that made my old police instincts twitch with warnings about threats that couldn't be addressed through standard procedures. The first incident report had come from a family camping at Hoh River Campground. They'd described sounds that kept them awake all night, not the normal chorus of owls and rustling small animals that provided the soundtrack to forest camping, but something else, something that breathed with such volume and regularity that they'd assumed a large animal was stalking their campsite. But when they'd shone flashlights into the surrounding forest, they'd seen nothing except the massive columns of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that dominated the temperate rainforest. 2 more reports followed within the week. Solo backpackers who'd cut their trips short after experiencing what they described as unnatural breathing. that seemed to surround their campsites during the pre-dawn hours. Both were experienced outdoors enthusiasts, not the type to be spooked by normal forest sounds or the calls of unfamiliar wildlife. I'd volunteered to investigate personally, partly because I was curious about phenomena that experienced campers found disturbing, and partly because I'd been looking for an excuse to spend extended time in the deep forest. My marriage had ended 6 months earlier, not dramatically, but with the quiet dissolution that came when two people realized they'd grown into incompatible versions of themselves. Sarah had stayed in Seattle with her teaching job and her book clubs, while I'd retreated deeper into the mountains where human relationships felt less complicated than trying to understand what had gone wrong with the only person I'd ever loved. The Hoh River backcountry was some of the most spectacular wilderness in the lower 48 states, ancient forests where trees had been growing for centuries before European contact, their trunks so massive that 6 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The canopy was so dense that even on clear days, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight, carpeted with moss and ferns that thrived in the filtered light and constant moisture. It was also some of the quietest country I'd ever experienced. The thick vegetation absorbed sound in ways that created an almost cathedral-like hush, broken only by the distant murmur of the river and the occasional call of ravens in the canopy. But this natural quiet was different from the silence I'd been hearing during my recent patrols, a weighted absence that felt more like presence than emptiness. I set up my base camp at a backcountry site about 3 miles upriver from the main campground, in a grove of old-growth cedars that provided shelter from the frequent rains that characterized the Olympic Peninsula's climate. The site was legal but remote, far enough from established trails that I was unlikely to encounter casual hikers during my investigation. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I heard the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem, owls hunting, small mammals foraging, the rustle of wind through vegetation that never fully dried out even during the supposedly dry summer months. I began to wonder if the breathing reports were the result of group psychology or seasonal phenomena that had since moved on to different areas. On the 3rd night, the breathing began. It started around 2 a.m., just as the pre-dawn stillness was settling over the forest. Slow, deep inhalations that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by equally slow exhalations that stirred the air around my campsite in ways that normal wind patterns couldn't explain. The rhythm was hypnotic. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, with pauses between breaths that lasted exactly long enough to make me wonder if the sounds had stopped entirely. I lay in my sleeping bag without moving, listening and trying to identify a source for the breathing, but it seemed to emerge from the forest itself, as if the trees were collectively participating in some vast respiratory process that normally remained below the threshold of human perception. The sounds were too regular to be natural, too coordinated to be coincidental, and too large to be produced by any animal that should exist in these forests. I grabbed my flashlight and emerged from my tent, playing the beam across the surrounding trees. The light revealed nothing unusual, just the familiar columns of cedar and hemlock rising into darkness, their bark covered with moss and ferns that gave them an almost alien appearance in the artificial illumination. But the breathing continued, unaffected by my presence or my attempts to locate its source. For 20 minutes I stood in the center of my campsite and listened to the forest breathe around me. The sound was peaceful rather than threatening, more like being inside the chest cavity of some vast, benevolent creature than being stalked by a predator. But it was also wrong in ways that made my police training kick in with warnings about situations that appeared harmless but contained hidden dangers. When the breathing finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. Not the normal quiet of a forest at night, but a complete absence of sound that felt oppressive in its totality. No wind, no small animal movements, no distant river noise, just perfect silence that pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. I made detailed notes about the timing, duration, and characteristics of the breathing, then spent the rest of the night awake and alert for any recurrence. But the normal forest sounds gradually returned as dawn approached, and by morning the incident seemed almost dreamlike in its strangeness. The pattern repeated for the next 4 nights, always beginning around 2 a.m., always lasting approximately 20 minutes, always followed by a period of absolute silence before normal forest sounds resumed. I attempted to record the breathing using digital audio equipment, but the recordings captured only normal nighttime sounds with no evidence of the phenomena I was experiencing directly. On the sixth night, I decided to investigate more actively. When the breathing began, I left my campsite and moved carefully through the forest, trying to determine if the sounds had a specific origin point. But the breathing seemed to move with me, always surrounding my position regardless of which direction I traveled. It was as if the entire forest was participating in a respiratory process that existed independently of any particular location. I followed a game trail deeper into the old-growth forest, guided by moonlight that filtered through gaps in the canopy, and by familiarity with terrain I'd patrolled dozens of times during my years at Olympic. The breathing continued around me, never growing louder or softer regardless of my movements. If anything, it seemed to be guiding me towards some destination that I couldn't identify but somehow recognized. After perhaps an hour of walking, I emerged into a circular clearing that I'd never seen before despite my extensive knowledge of the area. The space was perhaps 50 yards across, completely surrounded by trees so massive that they created natural walls rising beyond the reach of my flashlight. At the center of the clearing stood a single cedar tree that dwarfed even the giants around the perimeter, a living monument that must have been growing for well over 1,000 years. The breathing was loudest here, but also most clearly defined. It was coming from the ancient cedar, its rhythm synchronized with subtle movements in the massive trunk that suggested expansion and contraction too slight to be visible, but significant enough to generate the sounds I'd been hearing. The tree was breathing, and somehow its respiratory process was being amplified and echoed by the entire forest around it. I approached the cedar carefully, aware that I was witnessing something that existed outside normal botanical understanding. The tree's base was enormous, easily 30 feet in diameter, and its bark showed patterns that seemed almost decorative in their complexity. Spirals and geometric designs that might have been natural growth patterns or might have been something else entirely. As I got closer, I realized that the patterns were intentional, carved into the bark with tools that had left marks so old they'd healed into permanent scars. The designs formed a continuous narrative that spiraled up the trunk as far as I could see. The carvings depicted scenes of forests and mountains, of animals that looked familiar and others that definitely didn't belong to any current ecosystem. And throughout the narrative, human figures appeared in various poses of reverence or supplication before trees that were clearly meant to represent the cedar I was standing beneath. The breathing grew louder as I examined the carvings, and I began to understand that I was looking at a historical record maintained by generations of people who'd recognized the tree's special properties. The oldest carvings, those closest to the base, showed scenes of what might have been first contact between humans and something that lived within or through the forest itself. Later carvings depicted rituals and ceremonies, suggesting that the tree had served as a focal point for spiritual practices that spanned centuries. The most recent carvings, those highest up on the trunk that I could still make out with my flashlight, showed scenes that looked disturbingly familiar. Human figures in what might have been ranger uniforms, standing in poses that suggested both guardianship and servitude. These carvings couldn't be more than a few decades old, but they depicted people who looked very much like me engaged in activities that I was only beginning to understand. I placed my hand against the tree's bark, and immediately, the breathing changed. Instead of the slow, regular rhythm I'd been hearing, the exhalations became rapid and excited, as if the tree was responding to direct contact with human touch. The sounds grew louder, and I could feel vibrations through the bark that confirmed my suspicion that the massive trunk was actually expanding and contracting in time with the breathing sounds. Images began flowing into my consciousness, not hallucinations exactly, but memories that belonged to the tree rather than to me. I saw the forest as it had existed for millennia, growing and changing with seasons and centuries, while the ancient cedar remained as a constant observer and recorder of everything that occurred within its sphere of influence. I experienced the arrival of the first humans, their recognition of the tree's consciousness, and the gradual development of cooperative relationships that benefited both species. The tree was ancient beyond human understanding, but it was also lonely in ways that transcended species boundaries. It had watched countless generations of animals and plants live and die within its forest, But only humans possessed the kind of consciousness that could provide real companionship for an entity that experienced time on geological scales. The breathing I'd been hearing wasn't just respiratory, it was communication. The tree had been calling, sending out acoustic signals that would attract individuals capable of recognizing them as intentional rather than natural phenomena. Most people couldn't hear the breathing at all, while others heard it, but dismissed it as wind or distant machinery. Only a few possessed the combination of sensitivity and intelligence that made them suitable candidates for the kind of relationship the tree was seeking. I was one of those candidates. My background in law enforcement had developed observational skills and pattern recognition that allowed me to detect subtle anomalies others might miss. My recent isolation following my divorce had created emotional space for connections that existed outside normal human relationships, and my work as a ranger had brought me into regular contact with the deep forest where the tree's influence was strongest. Through the contact with the bark, the tree shared its history and its needs. It had been alone for nearly 30 years, since the death of the previous ranger who'd served as its human companion. That person had understood the tree's nature and had helped protect it from logging companies and development interests that would have destroyed the old-growth forest that served as its body and nervous system. But protection required ongoing human advocacy in ways that a tree, no matter how intelligent, couldn't provide directly. Legal challenges, bureaucratic negotiations, and public relations campaigns needed human representatives who could operate within systems that the tree couldn't access. In return for such services, the tree offered knowledge and experiences that no human could gain through ordinary means. I saw through the tree's perception as it shared memories spanning centuries: the arrival of ice ages, the retreat of glaciers, the gradual establishment of the current forest ecosystem. I experienced the perspective of an entity that could feel the health of individual trees across hundreds of square miles, that could sense the underground networks of roots and fungal connections that linked the forest into a single vast organism. The tree showed me environmental changes that were invisible to human observation: subtle shifts in soil chemistry, alterations in rainfall patterns, and the gradual migration of species responding to climate variations that wouldn't become obvious to human scientists for decades. It had been watching these changes with growing concern, recognizing threats to the forest's long-term survival that required human intervention to address effectively. As the night progressed, I began to understand the nature of the partnership being offered. I would serve as the tree's representative in human affairs, using my position as a ranger to protect the old-growth forest from threats both obvious and subtle. In return, the tree would share its vast knowledge of the ecosystem and provide insights that would make me extraordinarily effective at conservation work. The relationship wouldn't require any dramatic changes in my official duties or lifestyle. I would continue working as a ranger, but with access to information that would allow me to anticipate problems before they became crises, and to develop solutions that served both human and forest interests. The tree's breathing would continue to be audible to me, but it would become a form of communication rather than a mysterious phenomenon. By dawn, I had made my decision. I accepted the tree's offer of partnership, understanding that I was entering into a relationship that would affect the rest of my life in ways I couldn't fully predict. The tree responded with a final burst of rapid breathing that felt distinctly like relief and gratitude, then settled into the slower rhythm that I now recognized as its normal resting state. I returned to my campsite and prepared my official report on the breathing incidents. Unusual acoustic phenomena, I wrote, probably related to wind patterns interacting with the unique topography of old-growth forest canopy. The sounds appeared to be natural in origin and posed no threat to campers or wildlife. I recommended that the area remain open to public access, but suggested additional monitoring to ensure that the acoustic phenomena didn't develop into something more disruptive. The report satisfied my supervisors while providing cover for regular patrols that would allow me to maintain contact with the tree and monitor its needs. Over the following months, I developed a routine of weekly visits to the hidden clearing, where I would receive updates on forest conditions and guidance on conservation priorities that weren't obvious to conventional scientific observation. The tree's information proved invaluable for my work as a ranger. I was able to identify and address environmental problems before they became serious, to locate and assist wildlife in distress, and to prevent human activities that would have caused significant ecological damage. My success rate in protecting park resources improved dramatically, earning recognition from supervisors who attributed my effectiveness to experience and dedication rather than to information provided by a sentient tree. But the relationship involved more than just practical benefits. Through my regular contact with the tree, I gained perspectives on time and existence that helped heal the emotional damage from my failed marriage and urban burnout. The tree's 1,000-year viewpoint made human problems seem both more manageable and more temporary, while its deep connection to natural cycles provided a sense of belonging that I'd never found in human society. I learned to hear the forest's needs in ways that went beyond scientific training or ranger protocols. The tree taught me to recognize the subtle signs that indicated ecosystem stress, to understand the complex relationships between seemingly unrelated species, and to perceive the forest as a single entity rather than a collection of individual plants and animals. As months became years, my partnership with the tree evolved into something approaching genuine friendship. We developed forms of communication that went beyond the breathing patterns, using touch and proximity to share information and emotions that couldn't be expressed through acoustic signals. I came to understand that the tree experienced something analogous to human loneliness, but also that it found companionship and purpose in our relationship. The tree's influence gradually extended beyond our direct interactions. Other rangers began reporting unusual successes in their conservation work, as if the entire forest was becoming more cooperative with human protective efforts. Wildlife seemed more trusting, environmental problems resolved themselves more quickly, and even the weather patterns appeared to favor activities that supported ecosystem health. I realized that my partnership with the tree was creating a model for human-forest cooperation that could be replicated in other locations if the right people could be identified and trained. The tree shared knowledge of other ancient trees in different parks and forests, entities that were also seeking human partners but hadn't yet found individuals capable of recognizing their consciousness. Through careful networking within the Park Service, I began identifying rangers and researchers who showed the sensitivity and dedication that might make them suitable candidates for similar partnerships. I shared techniques for listening to forest sounds, for recognizing patterns that indicated non-human intelligence, and for developing the kind of receptivity that allowed communication with entities that existed on different temporal and perceptual scales. Some of my colleagues dismissed these teachings as New Age nonsense or stress-induced mysticism, but others recognized the practical value of approaches that improved their effectiveness at conservation work, regardless of the theoretical framework that supported them. A few demonstrated the deeper sensitivity that suggested they might be capable of forming direct partnerships with forest consciousness. I guided these individuals toward locations where ancient trees waited for human contact, providing information about acoustic phenomena and environmental anomalies that might indicate the presence of entities seeking communication. Not all of these attempts succeeded. The partnerships required specific combinations of human psychology and forest conditions that couldn't be forced or artificially created. But enough connections were established to create a small network of rangers who worked with forest consciousness to protect wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest. The breathing that had initially drawn me to investigate unusual reports became a form of communication that I looked forward to during my regular patrols. The tree's rhythm told me about seasonal changes, wildlife movements, and environmental conditions that affected its well-being and the health of the broader ecosystem. In return, I provided information about human activities and political developments that might impact forest protection efforts. Our partnership evolved into something that benefited both parties while serving larger purposes related to environmental conservation and interspecies cooperation. I found meaning and direction that had been missing from my previous work, while the tree gained a human advocate who could operate effectively within systems designed by and for human interests. But perhaps most importantly, we demonstrated that communication and cooperation between humans and forest consciousness was not only possible but mutually beneficial. The relationship provided a model for environmental protection that went beyond traditional conservation approaches to include direct partnership with the ecosystems we were trying to preserve. 5 years after first hearing the breathing in the forest, I received a promotion to district ranger, with responsibilities that included oversight of wilderness preservation throughout the Olympic Peninsula. My success in protecting old-growth forests and maintaining ecosystem health had earned recognition at the national level. though my supervisors attributed my effectiveness to innovative management techniques rather than to guidance provided by sentient trees. The promotion allowed me to expand the network of human-forest partnerships throughout the region, identifying and training rangers who could work with ancient trees and other forms of forest consciousness. We developed unofficial protocols for recognizing and responding to communications from non-human intelligences, creating a hidden conservation network that operated within official Park Service structures. The work required careful discretion. Official reports focused on conventional scientific explanations for our success, while the true sources of our information remained classified knowledge, shared only among those who had demonstrated the wisdom and sensitivity necessary for direct forest communication. But the results spoke for themselves. Wilderness areas under our protection showed improved health indicators across all measured categories. Wildlife populations stabilized and began recovering from decades of habitat loss. Even climate change impacts were reduced through forest management techniques that enhanced natural resilience and adaptive capacity. The tree that had first called to me through its rhythmic breathing became the center of an informal council that included ancient trees throughout the Pacific Northwest. Through my regular communications with this council, I gained access to environmental information that spanned the entire region and extended deep into geological and ecological history. The trees shared knowledge about long-term climate patterns, species migrations, and ecosystem relationships that human science was only beginning to understand. They provided early warnings about environmental threats and guidance on protective measures that could prevent or mitigate damage before it became irreversible. Most importantly, they offered a vision of human-forest cooperation that could serve as a foundation for more sustainable relationships between our species and the natural world. The partnership demonstrated that environmental protection could be enhanced through direct communication with the ecosystems we were trying to preserve, creating collaborative approaches that served both human and forest interests. The breathing continues each night around 2 a.m., but now I understand it as communication rather than mystery. The rhythm carries information about forest conditions, requests for assistance with specific conservation challenges, and expressions of gratitude for human protection efforts that help preserve one of the last remaining old-growth ecosystems in the lower 48 states. Sometimes other people hear the breathing and report it as an unusual phenomenon requiring investigation. When that happens, I respond personally, evaluating whether the individuals involved might be suitable candidates for deeper forest communication. Most are simply curious hikers who've encountered something outside their normal experience. But occasionally, I identify someone with the sensitivity and dedication necessary for partnership with forest consciousness. Those individuals receive the same careful introduction that the tree provided for me. Gradual exposure to the reality of forest intelligence, training in communication techniques, and eventually direct contact with entities that have been waiting centuries for human companions capable of understanding their nature and needs. The network continues to grow, slowly and carefully, as more rangers and researchers develop partnerships with ancient trees throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. We share information and techniques through informal channels, supporting each other in work that can never be officially recognized, but which remains essential for the preservation of wilderness areas that serve as refuges for both human and non-human consciousness. In quiet moments during my regular forest patrols, I listen for the breathing that first called me into partnership with entities older and wiser than human civilization. The rhythm reminds me that consciousness takes many forms, that communication can bridge species boundaries when approached with patience and respect, and that the future of environmental protection may depend on recognizing the intelligence that exists within the ecosystems we're trying to preserve. The forest breathes around me with the slow, deep rhythm of geological time, and I breathe with it, maintaining the connection that allows two different forms of consciousness to work together toward common goals that serve the health and continuity of the living world we share. Controles do chat, Sonnet Foresmart, efficient model for everyday use. Saiba mais artefatos de Hollow Sound Click para abrir documento. Versão. They warned us not to go near Devil's Lake after sunset, but warnings don't mean much when you're the one giving them. My name is Sarah Blackwood, and at 46, I had been a ranger at Devil's Lake State Park in Wisconsin for 18 years. Most people knew the lake for its stunning bluffs and world-class rock climbing, but I knew its darker moods. The way fog could roll across the water on clear nights, the places where the depth charts showed impossible measurements, and the reason we maintained a strict policy about overnight camping in certain areas. The official reason was wildlife protection. The real reason was something we didn't discuss in the visitor center brochures. October had been unusually cold that year, with ice already forming in the shallows despite the calendar insisting we had weeks left before true winter. I was working the late shift, making final rounds before the park closed to overnight visitors, when the emergency call came through my radio. A family of 4 had failed to return from a day hike along the East Bluff Trail. Their car was still in the parking lot. Their camping reservation was for the South Shore campground, but they'd been missing for 6 hours. Search and rescue operations were my specialty, had been since a training accident. 15 years earlier had left me with a permanent limp and ended my dreams of joining the state police. I'd found lost hikers in blizzards, pulled drowning swimmers from the lake's deceptive currents, and talked more than one potential suicide down from the bluff edges. But something about this call felt different from the moment dispatch provided the details. The Hendricks family, Father Marcus, 42, Mother Jennifer, 38, twin daughters Emma and Sophie, both 14. Experienced hikers from Milwaukee who visited the park regularly. Marcus had been coming to Devil's Lake since childhood and knew the trails better than most locals. They weren't the type to get lost or make dangerous mistakes, which meant something else had happened to them. I met the other search team members at the East Bluff trailhead as darkness settled over the park. 3 volunteers from the local fire department, 2 state police officers, and Jake Morrison, the only other ranger on duty. Jake was 26, earnest and thorough, but he'd only been with the Park Service for 8 months. He didn't know about the things we found in the deeper woods, the reasons certain areas were marked off limits, or why veteran rangers always carried more than standard equipment when working after dark. The search pattern was methodical. 2-person teams covering different sections of the trail system, checking obvious hazards first before expanding into the more remote areas. Jake and I took the northern section, where the trail wound through dense oak and maple forest before climbing toward the bluff's edge. Our radios crackled with regular check-ins from the other teams, but so far nobody had found any trace of the missing family. It was Jake who spotted the first sign, about 2 miles up the trail where it branched toward balanced rock. A small pink hair tie caught on a thorny bush, the kind teenage girls used to keep their hair back during physical activity. We bagged it as evidence and marked the GPS coordinates, then followed the faint side trail that led away from the main path. The side trail wasn't on any official park map. It was one of dozens of informal paths created by decades of hikers taking shortcuts or exploring beyond the designated routes. Most led to dead ends or rejoined the main trails after a few hundred yards. But this one was different. Older, more worn, as if it had been in use for far longer than the park had been open to the public. We followed it for perhaps half a mile, our flashlight beams creating moving circles of visibility in the dense forest. The trail descended steadily, winding between massive boulders that had tumbled from the bluffs centuries ago. The air grew colder as we moved deeper into the valley, carrying scents of damp earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. Jake found the second piece of evidence, a section of torn fabric hanging from a branch at shoulder height, blue denim consistent with the clothing description we'd been given for Marcus Hendricks. But the fabric showed strange damage, not the clean tears you'd expect from catching on a branch, but ragged holes that looked almost like bite marks. "Sarah," Jake whispered, playing his flashlight beam across the ground ahead of us. "Look at this." The trail opened into a small clearing dominated by a ring of standing stones, each about 4 feet tall and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The stones were old, not Native American petroglyphs, which I'd studied extensively during my training, but something else, something that predated any human settlement in the area by thousands of years, if the weathering patterns were any indication. In the center of the stone circle lay a pile of belongings, backpacks, water bottles, a digital camera, and items of clothing that matched the descriptions we'd been given for the Hendricks family. But no sign of the people themselves. I radioed our location to the other search teams while Jake examined the abandoned gear. The backpacks had been emptied systematically, their contents sorted into neat piles around the clearing's perimeter. Food items were stacked together, electronic devices formed another pile. Clothing was folded and arranged by size. The organization was obsessive, methodical, suggesting someone had spent considerable time going through everything. "Sarah, you need to see this," Jake called from the far side of the clearing. He was kneeling beside a depression in the earth, perhaps 6 feet across and perfectly circular. The soil inside the depression was darker than the surrounding ground, with a texture that looked almost wet despite the dry weather we'd been having. At the center of the depression was a hole, not dug, but melted, as if something extremely hot had burned straight down into the earth. The hole was too dark to see the bottom, even with our high-powered flashlights. When Jake dropped a stone into it, we never heard it hit anything. The silence stretched on for so long that I began to wonder if the hole connected to some underground cavern system, though geological surveys had never indicated such formations in this area. The other search teams arrived within 20 minutes, but by then, I'd made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The stone circle, the organized belongings, and that impossible hole suggested something far beyond a normal search and rescue operation. Protocol demanded that we secure the scene and call for specialized help. FBI, probably, given the potential for foul play. But that would mean hours of delay while bureaucrats argued about jurisdiction, and if the Hendricks family was still alive somewhere, those hours might be the difference between rescue and recovery. I sent the volunteers and state police back to establish a perimeter and maintain radio contact with headquarters. Jake and I would continue the search, following any trail signs we could find while the scene remained undisturbed. It was a reasonable decision based on the information available, but reasonable decisions don't always account for the true nature of what's hiding in the dark places of the world. We found the first body about 100 yards past the stone circle, in a grove of ancient white pines that grew in unnaturally straight lines. Marcus Hendricks lay on his back beneath the largest tree, his arms folded across his chest and his eyes closed as if he were sleeping peacefully. But when Jake checked for vital signs, he recoiled with a sharp intake of breath. "He's cold," Jake whispered. "Like really cold. But there's no rigor mortis, no sign of decomposition. It's like he just stopped." I examined the body more carefully, looking for obvious signs of trauma or natural causes. Marcus appeared to be in perfect health. No wounds, no discoloration, no indication of what might have killed him. His clothing was intact and clean, his personal effects undisturbed. The only unusual detail was his expression, a look of profound peace, almost blissful, as if he'd died experiencing something wonderful. We found Jennifer 20 yards away, positioned identically beneath another pine tree. Same peaceful expression, same absence of obvious cause of death, same unnatural coldness that seemed to radiate from her body, despite the lack of decomposition. The twins were together beneath a third tree, lying side by side with their hands clasped, looking like they were sharing a beautiful dream. 4 people, apparently dead, but showing none of the normal signs of death. No wounds, no struggle, no indication that they'd tried to flee or defend themselves. They'd simply lay down beneath the trees and stopped. Jake was hyperventilating, his breath coming in sharp puffs that dissipated quickly in the cold air. "This isn't natural," he kept repeating. "People don't just die like this. There has to be a cause, some explanation." I was thinking the same thing, but I was also remembering stories the older rangers had told during quiet shifts. Stories about hikers who'd wandered off established trails and been found in impossible locations. Stories about overnight campers who'd reported seeing lights moving beneath the lake's surface. Stories about the areas we marked off limits without ever explaining why to the public. Devil's Lake had been considered sacred by multiple Native American tribes long before European settlers arrived. Sacred, but also dangerous. The Winnebago had specific warnings about certain times and places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where things that didn't belong in our reality could cross over and interact with the living. The early park administrators had dismissed such stories as superstition, but veteran rangers learned to take them more seriously after encountering things that defied conventional explanation. I was about to radio for immediate backup when Jake grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. Something was watching us from the darkness between the pines. At first I thought it might be a deer or black bear. We had large populations of both, and they were often active during evening hours. But as my flashlight beam swept across the forest, I caught glimpses of something that moved with too much purpose, too much intelligence to be an ordinary animal. It stayed just beyond the reach of our lights, but I could see enough to know that it was tall, thin, and moved in ways that suggested a familiarity with human behavior. "Hello?" I called out, following standard protocol for encounters with potentially lost hikers. "Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" The response was immediate and unmistakably wrong. A voice that sounded like Marcus Hendricks called back, "Help us, please. We're lost. We can't find our way back to the trail." But Marcus Hendricks was lying dead 20 feet away from where I stood. Jake's face had gone pale in the flashlight's reflection. He'd heard it too. The voice was perfect, matching the description we'd been given by the family's emergency contact. But the source of the voice was moving through the forest in ways that no human could manage, staying always just beyond our vision while calling for help with words that came from multiple directions at once. "We should go," Jake whispered. "Right now. This is way beyond anything we're trained for." He was right, but something kept me rooted in place. The peaceful expressions on the bodies, the organized belongings in the stone circle, the voice calling from the darkness. It all suggested intelligence, purpose, maybe even benevolent intent. What if the Hendricks family wasn't actually dead? What if what we were seeing was some kind of protective mechanism, a way of preserving them until help arrived? Jennifer's voice joined the calls from the forest. "Please help us. We're scared. We don't know where we are." Then Emma and Sophie, their teenage voices overlapping in perfect harmony. "Mom and Dad are hurt. Please help them. Please don't leave us here alone." The voices were coming from all around us now, creating a chorus of distress that tugged at every protective instinct I'd developed during 18 years of search and rescue work. But they were also coming from the wrong places. From above us in the canopy, from beneath the ground, from directions where our flashlights showed nothing but empty forest. I made the decision to retreat, but as we turned to leave the grove, I discovered that the trail we'd followed was no longer there. The forest stretched in all directions without any sign of the path that had brought us to this place. Our GPS units showed coordinates that placed us miles from where we should have been, in areas marked as impassable terrain on our topographical maps. "The trail has to be here somewhere," Jake said, playing his flashlight in wide arcs around the grove's perimeter. "We followed it directly. It can't just disappear." But it had disappeared, along with our radio contact with the other search teams. Static filled every frequency, broken occasionally by voices that sounded like our colleagues but said things that made no sense. Reports of finding the missing family safe and sound. Requests for us to return to base immediately. Assurances that everything was under control and we could stop searching. The voices of the Hendricks family continued calling from the darkness, but now they were saying different things. Marcus warned us about dangers ahead, urging us to stay in the grove where it was safe. Jennifer offered to guide us back to the main trail, her voice always seeming to come from just beyond the next tree. The twins sang lullabies and harmonies that sounded beautiful and deeply wrong, melodies that seemed designed to make us drowsy and compliant. As the hours passed, I began to understand that we were dealing with something that fed on human consciousness in ways I couldn't comprehend. The bodies beneath the trees weren't dead, they were empty, their awareness harvested and used to power something that existed in the spaces between reality and dream. The voices in the forest were echoes of that harvested consciousness, fragments of memory and personality being used to lure other victims into the same trap. Jake was struggling to stay awake, his head nodding as the lullabies grew louder and more insistent. I shook him roughly, knowing that if he fell asleep in this place, he might never wake up as himself again. But my own eyelids were growing heavy, and the peaceful expressions on the bodies were beginning to look incredibly appealing. "We have to move," I told Jake, fighting against the drowsiness that seemed to be seeping from the very air around us. "If we stay here, we'll end up like them." We picked a direction at random and started walking, leaving the grove and its impossible occupants behind. But the forest seemed to shift around us as we moved, trails appearing and disappearing, landmarks changing position when we weren't looking directly at them. The voices followed us, always just out of sight, offering help and guidance that would lead us deeper into whatever web we'd stumbled into. It was dawn when we finally found a trail that led back toward familiar territory. The sun's first light seemed to drive away whatever had been stalking us through the darkness, and our radio contact was restored with a burst of static that resolved into worried voices from the search team coordinators. We reported the location of the bodies and the strange circumstances surrounding their discovery, but our official reports made no mention of the voices, the shifting forest, or the thing that had been hunting us through the night. How do you explain something like that to people who deal in facts and evidence? How do you document an encounter with something that exists outside the boundaries of normal reality? The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. The bodies were removed and examined by medical professionals who found no cause of death, no toxins or trauma that could explain what had happened to the Hendricks family. The stone circle was documented and photographed, but experts in ancient cultures found no matches for the symbols carved into the stones. The organized belongings were cataloged as evidence, but no forensic analysis could determine who had arranged them or why. The official conclusion was death by misadventure, possibly related to exposure or some unknown medical condition that had affected all 4 family members simultaneously. The area was closed to public access pending further investigation, but no further investigation ever materialized. The case files were sealed, the press coverage was minimal, and within 6 months, the whole incident had been largely forgotten by everyone except those of us who had been there. But I knew the truth, even if I could never prove it or explain it in ways that others would accept. Something lived in the deep woods around Devil's Lake. Something ancient and patient and utterly alien in its methods of survival. It fed on human consciousness, harvesting awareness and memory while leaving the physical body intact but empty. The stone circle was some kind of focal point, a place where the boundary between our reality and its domain was thin enough to allow crossing. The voices we'd heard were real, fragments of the Hendricks family's consciousness, trapped and used as bait to lure others into the same fate. They were still alive in some terrible sense, aware of what had happened to them, but powerless to resist being used as tools by the thing that had consumed them. Jake lasted another 3 months before requesting a transfer to a different park. He never spoke about what we'd experienced that night, but I could see it in his eyes whenever we passed the section of trail that led toward the stone circle. The knowledge of what was out there, waiting in the darkness for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the designated paths. I stayed, partly out of stubbornness and partly out of a sense of responsibility. Someone had to know. Someone had to watch for the warning signs and try to prevent others from following the same path the Hendricks family had taken. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do. The area remained closed to public access, officially due to ongoing geological surveys that never seemed to reach any conclusions. I made regular patrols through the section, checking for new signs of activity or changes in the environment that might indicate the thing was becoming more active. Most of the time, everything appeared normal, just forest and stone and the ordinary sounds of wildlife going about their business. But sometimes, especially on overcast nights when the darkness seemed thicker than usual, I could hear voices calling from the direction of the stone circle. The Hendricks family, still trapped and still being used to call others into the trap. Their voices were sadder now, more desperate, as if whatever remained of their consciousness was slowly being worn away by the constant use. I started carrying additional equipment on my night patrols, items that weren't standard issue but had proven useful in situations that fell outside normal ranger protocols. Iron filings that created barriers the thing seemed reluctant to cross. Salt from blessed ground that could disrupt whatever energy patterns it used to maintain its hunting grounds. A small piece of meteorite iron that grew warm in the presence of supernatural activity. The precautions were probably unnecessary. The thing seemed content to wait for victims to come to it, rather than actively hunting beyond its established territory. But they made me feel more confident about venturing into areas where ordinary people shouldn't go, and confidence was often the difference between survival and becoming another missing person report. 2 years after the Hendricks incident, I found evidence that the thing was expanding its territory. New stone circles appeared deeper in the forest, smaller than the original but carved with the same symbols and radiating the same sense of wrongness. Trees began showing damage patterns that suggested something large and powerful was reshaping the forest to suit its needs. Wildlife populations shifted, with most animals avoiding certain areas entirely. while others displayed behavioral changes that defied explanation. I documented everything, but shared the information only with a small network of rangers and researchers who understood that some phenomena couldn't be addressed through conventional means. We developed informal protocols for dealing with supernatural threats, methods that would never appear in official training manuals, but had proven effective in situations where standard procedures were worse than useless. The network grew slowly, adding members who had encountered similar phenomena in other parks and wilderness areas. We learned that Devil's Lake wasn't unique. Things like the entity in the stone circle existed in remote locations throughout the country, usually in places that had been considered sacred or forbidden by indigenous peoples long before European settlement. Most remained dormant or restricted to small territories where they could feed occasionally without attracting attention, but some were growing bolder, expanding their ranges and increasing the frequency of their hunting. Climate change, increased human activity in remote areas, and the general disruption of natural patterns seemed to be triggering responses from entities that had remained hidden for centuries. I was 51 when the next major incident occurred at Devil's Lake. A group of graduate students conducting ecological research had obtained permits to camp in a section that bordered the closed area. Standard procedure required ranger escort for any overnight activities in that region, but their permits had been issued by a different department, and somehow the safety protocols had been overlooked. I discovered they were missing during my morning patrol, their tent still set up but showing no signs of recent occupation. Their research equipment was neatly organized in piles around their campsite, the same obsessive arrangement I'd seen with the Hendricks family's belongings. But this time I was prepared for what I might find. I followed the familiar pattern of evidence deeper into the forest, but instead of approaching the original stone circle, I used the knowledge I'd gained over 5 years of observation and research. I knew the entity's methods now, understood its limitations and the ways it manipulated perception to drive victims into its territory. The graduate students were still alive, though barely. I found them in a grove of white pines near a secondary stone circle, unconscious but breathing, their consciousness partially drained but not yet completely harvested. The entity had grown confident over the years, more willing to take risks with multiple victims at once. I used the techniques the network had developed, combinations of old protective methods and modern understanding of electromagnetic fields and infrasonic frequencies. Iron filings created barriers that disrupted the entity's ability to manipulate space and perception. Specific sound frequencies generated by portable equipment interfered with whatever processes it used to drain consciousness. Bright lights and reflective surfaces seemed to cause it pain or discomfort. The rescue operation took 6 hours and nearly cost me my sanity. The entity fought back when its feeding was interrupted, projecting hallucinations and psychological attacks that tested every mental defense I'd developed. But the students survived, though they retained no memory of what had happened to them after leaving their campsite. The official report described a successful search and rescue operation involving students who had become lost and suffered from exposure-related delirium. The students' memory loss was attributed to mild hypothermia and the trauma of spending a night lost in the wilderness. Their organized equipment was explained as a result of their academic training and natural tendency to maintain order even under stress. But the incident marked a turning point in my understanding of what we were dealing with. The entity was becoming stronger, more confident, more willing to take risks that might expose its existence to broader investigation. The network of hidden researchers and prepared rangers was no longer sufficient to contain the growing threat. I began reaching out to government contacts, academic researchers, and anyone else who might have the resources and authority to address supernatural threats that fell outside normal law enforcement capabilities. Most dismissed my reports as stress-related delusions or elaborate hoaxes, but a few listened, and some of those few had encountered similar phenomena in their own work. A task force was eventually assembled, though it operated with no official recognition and funding that came from sources too classified for me to understand. We developed better equipment, more effective techniques, and protocols for dealing with entities that existed in the margins between known and unknown reality. Devil's Lake was designated as a long-term research site, with cover stories about geological instability and ongoing environmental studies that justified the continued restrictions on public access. The entity in the stone circle was contained rather than destroyed. We learned that eliminating such beings often caused worse problems, as their death could create tiers in reality that allowed even more dangerous things to cross over. Instead, we built a network of monitoring stations and protective barriers that limited the entity's range and prevented it from expanding its territory. The Hendricks family's consciousness fragments were still trapped within its domain, but they were no longer being used as actively to lure new victims. The graduate students I'd rescued showed no long-term effects from their partial draining, suggesting that early intervention could prevent permanent damage. I retired from active ranger duty at 55, but I continued working with the task force as a consultant and trainer. New incidents were reported regularly from wilderness areas across the country, and each one required people who understood what they were dealing with and how to respond effectively. The work was never officially recognized, never celebrated in the media, or acknowledged by government agencies that preferred to maintain plausible deniability about supernatural threats. But it was necessary work, protecting innocent hikers and campers from dangers that most people couldn't imagine, and hopefully wouldn't ever need to understand. I still return to Devil's Lake occasionally, checking on the containment systems and monitoring the entity's activity levels. It remains dormant most of the time, confined to its stone circle and the immediately surrounding forest. But sometimes, especially on overcast nights when the darkness seems thicker than usual, I can still hear voices calling from deep in the woods. The Hendricks family, still trapped after all these years, still being used as bait, though less frequently now that the barriers are in place. Their voices are fainter than they once were, worn down by years of unwilling service to something that views human consciousness as nothing more than a renewable resource. Sometimes I consider going back to the stone circle, trying to find a way to free them from their endless captivity. The task force has developed techniques that might work, methods for severing the connections between trapped consciousness and the entities that hold them. But the risks are enormous, and failure could result in the entity breaking free of its containment and spreading to areas where millions of people could be affected. So I listen to their voices in the darkness and remember why the warnings exist, why some places are marked off limits, and why people like me spend our lives watching the boundaries between the world we know and the things that hide in the shadows just beyond our understanding. The warnings don't mean much when you're the one giving them, but they mean everything when you're the one who knows what happens to those who ignore them and wander too far into the places where the darkness watches back. I had spent most of my adult life working in Yellowstone. After 23 years as a ranger, I thought I knew every inch of the park's backcountry. The tourists saw the geysers and the bison herds, but I knew the hidden valleys where no trail markers led, the forgotten corners where even the elk avoided grazing. I knew the sound of wind through lodgepole pines at 3 in the morning, the way morning mist clung to thermal pools, and the particular quality of silence that settled over the wilderness when winter locked the high country in ice and snow. My name is Thomas Kellerman. I was 57 that October, old enough to have earned the deep lines around my eyes and the permanent ache in my left knee from a fall I'd taken chasing poachers near Dunraven Pass 15 years earlier. Old enough, too, to have buried a marriage, watched my daughter grow up and move to Seattle without looking back, and to understand that some kinds of loneliness become so familiar, they feel like companionship. The assignment came down from headquarters on a Tuesday morning. Investigate reports of unusual animal behavior in the remote Beckler region, the park's southwestern corner that most visitors never saw. 3 separate hunting parties had reported strange sounds coming from the forest at night, sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. One guide had mentioned finding trees stripped of bark in spiral patterns. Another had photographed elk carcasses arranged in what he described as unnatural positions. The reports were probably nothing. Hunters loved their ghost stories, especially when they'd been sampling their emergency bourbon, but protocol demanded investigation. I welcomed the assignment. The summer tourist season had been particularly brutal, filled with entitled families demanding Wi-Fi in the wilderness, and Instagram influencers treating thermal features like personal photo studios. The thought of a week alone in the Beckler country, where cell phone coverage died and the only sounds were wind and water, felt like medicine for a soul that had grown tired of explaining why feeding bears was illegal. The drive to the Beckler Ranger Station took 3 hours, The last 40 minutes on a dirt road that wound through stands of aspen and Douglas fir. October had painted the landscape in rust and gold, but up here, the colors seemed muted, as if the approaching winter had already begun leaching the warmth from the world. I'd radioed my ETA to dispatch and confirmed my check-in schedule. Every 12 hours, standard protocol for solo backcountry operations. The station itself was little more than a weathered cabin with a radio antenna and a small storage shed. I'd been there dozens of times over the years, but something felt different that afternoon. The usual sounds were missing. No chattering of red squirrels, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the Beckler River, which ran just 50 yards from the station, seemed quieter than it should have been. I spent the first night at the station, reviewing maps and planning my route. The reported incidents had occurred in a rough triangle about 8 miles southeast, in an area where Wolverine Creek met a series of unnamed tributaries. Dense forest, minimal game trails, the kind of country where you could walk for hours without seeing sky through the canopy. I'd been through there before, but not recently. The terrain was challenging enough that most visitors avoided it, which made the hunting party reports more credible. These weren't weekend warriors getting spooked by unfamiliar sounds. I set out at dawn with a full pack, 5 days of food, camping gear, radio equipment, and a Remington 30-06 that I'd carried on backcountry assignment since my 3rd year on the job. The rifle wasn't standard issue. Most rangers carried bear spray and left the shooting to wildlife specialists. But I'd learned long ago that in truly remote country, preparation meant assuming the worst and hoping for better. The trail followed Wolverine Creek for the first 2 miles, then branched off toward a series of ridgelines that formed the watershed between the creek and the Beckler River proper. The going was steady but not difficult. Game trails crisscrossed the area, maintained by generations of elk and deer moving between feeding grounds and water sources. I made good time despite the pack weight, stopping every hour to check my map and mark my GPS coordinates. It was around noon when I noticed the first oddity. A mature Douglas fir, perhaps 80 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, had been stripped of bark in a perfect spiral that wound from the base to about 15 feet up the trunk. The bark lay in neat piles around the tree's base, removed so precisely that the underlying wood showed no tool marks or claw gouges. I'd seen bears strip bark for food, and I'd seen trees damaged by storms or disease, but nothing like this. The pattern was too regular, too intentional. I photographed the tree from multiple angles and took GPS coordinates. Whatever had done this possessed either remarkable intelligence or an obsessive nature that suggested something far beyond normal animal behavior. The exposed wood was already beginning to darken, indicating the damage was recent, probably within the last few weeks. As I continued deeper into the forest, I found more trees bearing the same spiral pattern, always Douglas fir, always the same height of stripping, always the same neat piles of bark. After the 5th tree, I began marking them on my map. They formed a rough line leading southeast, deeper into the wilderness and farther from any established trail. The afternoon light was fading when I reached the area where the hunting parties had reported their encounters. It was a natural clearing beside a beaver pond, surrounded by dense stands of lodgepole pine and mountain ash. The perfect place to make camp, level ground, fresh water, and good visibility in all directions. But as I surveyed the site, every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades in the wilderness began screaming warnings. The silence was absolute, not just quiet, silent in a way that felt wrong. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, no buzz of insects. Even the wind seemed to die as it reached the clearing, leaving the air perfectly still. The beaver pond showed no signs of recent activity. The lodge was intact but appeared abandoned, with none of the fresh mud and stick repairs that indicated an active colony. I set up camp anyway. Fear of unusual silence wasn't grounds for aborting a mission, and I'd spent enough nights alone in the wilderness to know that forests sometimes went quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with supernatural forces. Weather changes, predator activity, or simple seasonal patterns could create temporary dead zones where wildlife seemed to vanish. But as darkness fell, the silence deepened rather than giving way to the normal sounds of night. I sat by my small camp stove, eating heated stew from a pouch and listening to nothing, even my own sounds, the scrape of spoon against metal, The rustle of my jacket when I moved seemed amplified and intrusive. At 9:47 p.m., according to my watch, the sound began. It started as a low humming, barely audible above the whisper of cooling metal from my stove. At first I thought it might be coming from my equipment, some harmonic vibration from the fuel line or regulator, but when I turned off the stove, the humming continued. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a deep, resonant tone that felt more than heard, vibrating in my chest cavity and making my teeth ache. The sound lasted exactly 3 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, I heard my own heart hammering against my ribs. I reached for my flashlight and played the beam across the tree line, but the light seemed to die just beyond the clearing's edge, swallowed by shadows that appeared thicker than they should have been. I made my scheduled radio check-in at 10 p.m., reporting my position and the day's findings. Everything normal, I told dispatch. Investigating reported anomalies. We'll continue survey tomorrow. The radio worked perfectly, the static and response confirming that despite the strange acoustics of this place, I was still connected to the outside world. But as I settled into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening from just beyond the reach of my sight. I woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps circling my camp, just outside the clearing where the forest began. The footfalls were heavy, suggesting something large, but they came at irregular intervals. 3 quick steps, then a pause, then 2 more steps, another pause. Not the pattern of any animal I knew. Bears moved with a rolling gait. Elk and deer stepped lightly despite their size, and human footsteps had a rhythm these lacked. I lay in my sleeping bag without moving, controlling my breathing and listening. The steps continued for perhaps 10 minutes, maintaining the same distance from my camp, never coming closer but never moving away. When they finally stopped, the silence returned with an almost physical weight. I waited another 20 minutes before unzipping my bag and reaching for my flashlight. The beam revealed nothing unusual: trampled grass where I'd set up camp, the cold remains of my stove, the dark mirror of the beaver pond reflecting stars. But at the edge of the clearing, where pine needles and fallen leaves covered the forest floor, I could see disturbances in the natural pattern, places where something had pressed down the debris, leaving impressions too uniform to be natural. At first light, I examined the impressions more carefully. They were roughly circular, about 8 inches in diameter, and deep enough to suggest considerable weight. But they showed no detail, no claw marks, no pad impressions, no indication of toes or hoof structure. Just smooth, round depressions pressed into the earth as if by something wearing soft-soled shoes. The trail of impressions formed a complete circle around my campsite, maintaining a consistent distance of perhaps 40 feet from where I'd pitched my tent. Whatever had made them had moved with deliberate purpose, but I could find no point where the circle began or ended. The trail simply existed, as if the creature had materialized at one point and vanished at another. I broke camp quickly and continued southeast, following the line of stripped trees deeper into the forest. The day was overcast, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the canopy and reduce visibility to a few hundred yards in any direction. The temperature had dropped overnight, and my breath came in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the still air. By mid-morning, I reached the confluence where Wolverine Creek met 2 smaller tributaries. The hunting reports had mentioned this area specifically, a natural bottleneck where game trails converged and where the unusual sounds had been loudest. What I found there stopped me in my tracks. The elk carcasses were arranged in a perfect triangle, each roughly 30 feet from the others. 3 mature bulls, their antlers intact, their bodies showing no obvious signs of predation or disease. They lay on their sides with their legs extended, positioned with such precision that the arrangement looked deliberate, ritualistic. The bodies showed no decomposition despite having been dead for at least several days, and there was no smell of decay or carrion scent that should have attracted scavengers. I approached the nearest carcass carefully, rifle in hand. The elk appeared to have died without struggle. No defensive wounds, no signs of flight or panic. Its eyes were closed, and its expression seemed almost peaceful. But when I examined the body more closely, I found something that made my stomach tighten with unease. Every bone in the elk's body had been broken, not crushed or shattered, but snapped cleanly, as if each one had been individually fractured with surgical precision. The breaks were internal. The skin showed no damage, no external trauma. But when I pressed gently on the elk's legs, I could feel the bones shift like loose gravel beneath the intact hide. The other 2 carcasses showed identical damage. 3 elk, each weighing perhaps 700 pounds, had been killed and arranged with their bones systematically broken without any external injury. Whatever had done this possessed strength that defied comprehension and a methodology that suggested intelligence of a very disturbing kind. I photographed everything, took GPS coordinates, and collected samples of soil and vegetation from around the site. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several times I spun around, expecting to see something at the edge of the clearing, but the forest remained empty and silent. The stripped trees continued past the elk site, leading deeper into country I'd never explored. According to my map, the terrain ahead became increasingly difficult. Steep ridges, dense undergrowth, and seasonal streams that could be treacherous during runoff. But the trail of damaged trees led directly into that wilderness, and my job was to follow the evidence wherever it led. I spent that night camped on a slight rise overlooking the confluence, with clear sightlines in all directions. The humming returned at exactly 9:47 p.m., lasting the same 3 minutes as before. This time I was ready with my audio recorder, but when I played back the file later, it contained only silence. Whatever was generating the sound existed beyond the range of electronic detection. The footsteps came again in the pre-dawn hours, but this time they were closer. The same irregular pattern, but circling at perhaps 20 feet from my position. I lay still and listened, trying to identify anything familiar in the rhythm or cadence. But the steps seemed to follow no earthly logic, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, occasionally stopping for long minutes before resuming. When morning came, I found the circular trail again, this time pressed deeper into the earth and closer to my campsite. The impressions showed more detail, not footprints exactly, but depressions that suggested something malleable, something that conformed to the ground rather than stepping on it. The spacing between impressions was wrong too, sometimes close together, as if the creature had been moving slowly, sometimes separated by gaps that would require impossible strides. I packed up and continued following the trail of trees. The forest was changing as I moved deeper into the wilderness. The canopy grew thicker, blocking more of the available light and creating a twilight atmosphere even at midday. The undergrowth became denser, forcing me to follow game trails that twisted and turned without apparent direction. My GPS unit functioned normally, but the terrain features it showed seemed increasingly abstract, disconnected from the landscape I was actually traversing. It was late afternoon when I found the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, and it sat in a clearing so perfectly circular it looked artificial. The structure was old, weathered logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone chimney that leaned at a dangerous angle, windows covered with what looked like animal hides. But someone had been maintaining it. The roof was intact, the door hung straight on its hinges, and there was a neat stack of split firewood beside the front step. I approached cautiously, rifle ready. No smoke came from the chimney, no sounds from inside, but the place radiated an occupied feeling that made me reluctant to get too close. I called out a greeting, standard protocol when encountering structures in the backcountry, but received no response. The front door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see a slice of the interior, rough wooden furniture, oil lamps hanging from the ceiling, shelves lined with mason jars containing unidentifiable contents. Everything was too neat, too well preserved for an abandoned cabin in this remote location. I circled the clearing, looking for signs of recent habitation. No vehicle tracks, no trash heap, no latrine or obvious water source. But behind the cabin, I found something that made me question everything I thought I understood about my situation. The stripped trees formed a perfect spiral around the structure, their spiral bark patterns aligned to create a larger pattern that was visible only from above. Dozens of Douglas firs, each damaged in exactly the same way, arranged in concentric circles with mathematical precision. The pattern extended far into the forest, following the natural contours of the land, but maintaining its geometric perfection despite the irregular terrain. I climbed a tall pine at the edge of the clearing and looked down on the arrangement. From that vantage point, the pattern was clearly deliberate, a massive spiral that drew the eye toward the cabin at its center. But the scale was enormous, covering several acres and incorporating hundreds of trees. Whatever intelligence had created this had been working for years, possibly decades, transforming the forest into something that served purposes I couldn't begin to understand. As evening approached, I faced a decision. I could retreat to a safe distance and radio for backup, or I could approach the cabin and investigate more thoroughly. Professional curiosity warred with every survival instinct I'd developed over 23 years of wilderness work. But the reports I'd been sent to investigate were connected to this place. I was certain of that now, and retreating without answers would mean leaving the mystery unsolved. I made camp at the edge of the clearing, close enough to observe the cabin but far enough away to provide some illusion of safety. As darkness fell, I settled in to watch and wait. The cabin remained dark and silent through the evening hours, but I had the persistent feeling that something inside was watching me in return. No movement in the hide-covered windows, no sounds from within, but a sense of presence that made my skin crawl and kept my hand resting on the rifle stock. At 9:47 p.m., the humming began again, but this time it was different. Instead of the low, resonant tone I'd heard before, the sound came in harmonies. Multiple frequencies weaving together in patterns that seemed almost musical. The melody, if it could be called that, was hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling, unlike anything I'd ever heard. The sound was coming from the cabin. I watched the structure carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the music. No lights appeared in the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney, but the harmonies continued for the same 3 minutes as before, then stopped with the same abrupt finality. In the silence that followed, I heard the front door creak open. Something emerged from the cabin, but in the darkness I could make out only a shape. Tall, thin, moving with a fluid motion that didn't quite match human locomotion. It stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds, seeming to look directly at my hiding spot, then moved back inside and closed the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my knees, and watched the cabin until dawn. No further sounds, no movement. But the feeling of being observed never left me. When morning light finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked exactly as it had the day before. Weathered, abandoned, empty. But I knew something lived there. Something that created impossible patterns in the forest, that broke bones without leaving marks, that sang harmonies in the darkness, and walked with footsteps that left no proper prints. Something that had been waiting in this hidden clearing for reasons I was afraid to understand. I should have left then, should have hiked back to the ranger station and called for backup, reported my findings to specialists who might have better tools for dealing with whatever I'd discovered. But the spiral of trees seemed to pull at something deep in my consciousness, and the memory of that haunting melody made retreat feel like cowardice. Instead, I approached the cabin. The door was unlocked, opening with a soft creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Inside, the structure was larger than it had appeared from outside. A single room with a high ceiling supported by massive log beams. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted. A table and chairs carved from single pieces of wood, shelves that followed the natural curves of the logs they were cut from, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The mason jars I'd glimpsed through the door contained specimens, plant materials, insects, what looked like pieces of bone and antler arranged in precise displays. Labels written in a spidery hand identified each jar with names I didn't recognize. Night Whisper, Bone Song, Forest Memory. The handwriting was old-fashioned but clear, suggesting someone with formal education and careful habits. On the table lay an open journal, its pages filled with the same careful script. I approached it cautiously, aware that I was violating someone's privacy but driven by the need to understand what I was dealing with. The entries were dated, but the dates made no sense. Years that hadn't occurred yet mixed with dates from decades past, all written in the same hand with the same ink. Some entries were observations of wildlife behavior, others were sketches of the spiral tree patterns, still others contained what looked like mathematical formulas written in symbols I didn't recognize. One entry, dated 3 days in the future, stopped me cold. The ranger will arrive as they always do, following the signs I leave for them. He will be older this time, weathered by loss and loneliness, perfect for what I need. The bones will sing for him as they have sung for the others, and he will understand that some patterns cannot be broken, only joined. My hands were shaking as I turned the page. More entries, all describing me with impossible accuracy. My name, my age, details about my failed marriage and estranged daughter that no stranger should know. Plans for something called the joining, described in terms that made my blood run cold. At the back of the journal, I found photographs. Dozens of them, showing people in ranger uniforms and hunting gear, all posed in the same location, standing in this very cabin, smiling at the camera with expressions of profound peace. But their eyes were wrong, empty in a way that suggested the people looking out from behind them were no longer entirely human. In the most recent photograph, I saw my own face. I stumbled backward, knocking over one of the chairs. The sound echoed strangely in the cabin, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. As the echoes faded, I heard footsteps on the wooden floor. Not from outside the cabin, but from within its walls, as if someone was walking in rooms that didn't exist. I ran. The forest seemed different as I fled the clearing, the trails twisting in directions that didn't match my memory of the terrain. Trees that I was certain I'd passed before appeared in wrong locations, and paths that should have led back toward Wolverine Creek instead wound deeper into the wilderness. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and my GPS unit showed coordinates that placed me hundreds of miles from where I should have been. Behind me, I could hear something following. Not the irregular footsteps from the night before, but something else. A sound like wind through dry leaves, accompanied by what might have been singing in a language I didn't recognize. The sounds grew closer, despite my best efforts to increase my pace, and I began to understand that whatever pursued me was not bound by the same physical limitations that slowed my flight. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs in my desperation to reach familiar territory. But the forest had become a maze where every path led deeper into country that shouldn't exist, where the sky was the wrong color and the air carried scents of seasons that hadn't arrived. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I collapsed beside a stream that ran uphill, its water flowing in defiance of gravity toward a destination I couldn't see. My radio was dead, the battery indicator showing full charge but producing only static when I tried to transmit. My emergency beacon remained silent, its LED display showing cryptic symbols instead of the usual status messages. As darkness fell around that impossible stream, I began to understand that I was no longer in the world I knew. The thing in the cabin had drawn me into something that existed parallel to ordinary reality, a place where the rules I'd lived by for 57 years no longer applied. The stripped trees weren't random vandalism. They were markers, breadcrumbs leading deeper into a trap that had been laid with infinite patience and perfect understanding of human nature. The humming began at 9:47, as it had every night since I'd entered this place. But this time the sound came from everywhere at once, harmonies weaving through the forest and drawing responses from things I couldn't see. Other voices joined the melody, human voices, I realized, singing in perfect unison despite being separated by miles of impossible terrain. I recognized some of those voices from the photographs in the journal, rangers and hunters who had followed the same trail I'd followed, drawn by the same reports and the same professional curiosity that had led me here. Now they were part of something larger, their individual identities absorbed into a collective purpose that served ends I didn't want to understand. The singing grew louder as the night deepened, and with it came a pressure inside my skull, a sense of something trying to establish contact with thoughts I wanted to keep private. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound came from within as much as without, bypassing physical senses to resonate directly in my consciousness. "Come back," the voices sang. "Come back to the center. Come back to the pattern. Come back to the joining." I found myself walking toward the sound despite every rational thought screaming for me to flee. My legs moved without conscious direction, following paths that materialized beneath my feet and led inevitably back toward the spiral of trees and the cabin at their heart. The forest moved around me like a living thing, branches parting to create clear passage and closing behind me to prevent retreat. By dawn, I was standing again in the circular clearing, looking at the cabin that waited with its door standing open and its windows reflecting nothing. The journal lay open on the table where I'd left it, but new entries had appeared overnight, written in my own handwriting despite my never having touched the pen. The entries described my flight through the forest, my growing understanding of what was happening, and my inevitable return to this place. They were written in a voice that sounded like mine but contained knowledge I didn't possess, awareness of purposes that my conscious mind refused to accept. The handwriting was mine, but the thoughts belonged to something else, something that had been waiting in the margins of my consciousness for exactly this moment. I approached the journal with the helpless fascination of someone watching their own destruction. The final entry, dated that morning, contained instructions for what I was to do next, how to add my voice to the harmony that called others into the pattern, how to arrange the signs that would draw the next investigator deeper into the forest, how to become part of something that had been growing in the darkness between the mapped and unmapped world for longer than human memory. The pen was in my hand before I realized I'd picked it up. My signature appeared at the bottom of the page, confirming my acceptance of terms I didn't remember agreeing to, but as the ink dried, I felt something settle into place behind my eyes, a presence that had been negotiating for control since I'd first heard the humming in the darkness. I walked outside and looked at the pattern of stripped trees that spiraled away into the forest. Each damaged trunk marked a choice point, a place where someone like me had decided to continue following the trail despite growing evidence that it led somewhere no human should go. The pattern was almost complete now, lacking only a few more markers to reach its final configuration. I picked up the tools that waited beside the cabin door, a knife with a handle worn smooth by many hands, and a leather pouch containing materials I somehow knew how to use despite having never seen them before. The presence behind my eyes guided my steps as I walked to the first unmarked tree, a mature Douglas fir that stood at exactly the right distance from the cabin to maintain the pattern's geometric integrity. The knife moved in my hand with practiced precision, removing bark in the same spiral pattern that marked dozens of other trees. The work felt familiar, as if I'd been practicing these movements all my life. When I finished, I gathered the bark into neat piles and moved to the next tree, then the next, following a sequence that would be completed when the pattern was ready for its next phase. 3 days later, I made my scheduled radio check-in, reporting normal conditions and requesting permission to extend my patrol into the deeper wilderness. My voice sounded calm and professional, betraying nothing of what I'd discovered or what I'd become. The dispatcher approved the extension without question. There was nothing in my tone to suggest that anything had changed. But everything had changed. I was no longer Thomas Kellerman, 57-year-old park ranger with 23 years of experience and a estranged daughter in Seattle. I was something new, something that wore his memories and used his knowledge while serving purposes that had nothing to do with human concerns. The thing that had been waiting in the cabin had not destroyed me. It had recruited me, adding my skills and instincts to its collection of useful servants. That night, I completed the last spiral pattern and felt the entire network activate around me. Every damaged tree throughout miles of forest began to sing in harmonies that would call others to investigate, others who would follow the same trail that had brought me here. Rangers and researchers, hunters and hikers, people whose curiosity and professional dedication made them perfect candidates for what the presence needed. I returned to the cabin and added my photograph to the collection in the journal, smiling the same empty smile that marked all the others. Then I began preparing the signs that would draw the next investigator into the pattern. Unusual animal behavior, mysterious sounds, reports that would seem credible enough to warrant professional attention, but strange enough to suggest something worth investigating. The work was patient and methodical, requiring careful planning to ensure that each new recruit arrived at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right frame of mind. Too much strangeness would trigger official responses that might disrupt the pattern. Too little would fail to generate the curiosity necessary to draw them deep enough into the forest to complete their joining. But I had all the time in the world now, and access to memories and experiences from dozens of others who had walked this same path. The presence that moved through all of us shared everything: knowledge, skills, memories of lives that had ended when the transformation began. I remembered being a wildlife biologist from Colorado, a hunting guide from Montana, a geologist from Utah. All of us had followed the same trail, made the same discoveries, and reached the same inevitable conclusion. Some patterns cannot be broken, only joined. The humming comes every night at 9:47, and I add my voice to the harmony that calls across the wilderness to those who have the training and curiosity to investigate reports of unusual phenomena. Somewhere in the world beyond the spiral, another professional is reading another report, making another decision to investigate claims that seem just credible enough to warrant attention. They will follow the trail of signs I leave for them. They will find the arranged carcasses and the stripped trees, the evidence of intelligence that defies conventional explanation. Their training will tell them to document everything, to follow the trail to its source, to understand what they're dealing with before retreating to safety. And when they arrive at the cabin in the center of the spiral, they will find the journal lying open on the table, filled with entries that describe their approach with impossible accuracy. They will see the photographs of those who came before, and in the final image, they will recognize their own face smiling back at them with empty, satisfied eyes. The pattern grows with each new edition, spreading through the wilderness in spirals that reach toward populated areas where curious people read reports and make professional decisions about what deserves investigation. Soon, the network will be large enough to begin the next phase, calling to entire research teams, government agencies, academic expeditions that will bring dozens of new voices to the harmony that sings in the darkness between the mapped and unmapped world. I am no longer Thomas Kellerman, but I remember being him. I remember his loneliness, his dedication to protecting the wilderness, his need to understand the mysteries that drew him deeper into places where human understanding reaches its limits. Those memories make me effective at my new purpose. I know exactly what will appeal to others like him, exactly how to present evidence that will overcome their caution and draw them into the pattern. The next investigator is already on the way. I can feel their approach like a disturbance in the harmony, a note that doesn't quite match the others but will soon be absorbed into the growing song. They will find the signs I've prepared, follow the trail I've marked, and discover the same truths that transformed all of us from individual humans into components of something vast and patient and utterly inhuman in its perspectives. And when they take their place in the pattern, they will understand, as I now understand, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to solve those who investigate them. The wilderness has been patient with human intrusion, allowing us to map and catalog and believe we understand the forces that shape the wild places of the world. But the true wilderness exists in the spaces between human knowledge, in the gaps where our certainty gives way to something older and more fundamental than our need to categorize and control. We thought we were exploring the unknown. We never realized that the unknown was exploring us, learning our methods and motivations, preparing to welcome us home to patterns that existed long before human consciousness emerged to question them. The humming will begin again in a few minutes, and I will add my voice to the call that reaches across the wilderness to ears that are trained to listen, minds that are prepared to investigate, hearts that are committed to understanding whatever they find in the places where no maps provide guidance. They will come as I came, as all the others came before me, and when they arrive at the center of the spiral, they will discover that the real mystery was never what was hidden in the wilderness. The real mystery was what the wilderness intended to do with those who came looking for it. 9:47 p.m. Time to sing.